The river was already ancient when the city was still just a dream. It moved through the darkness the way rivers have always moved, slowly, heavily, with a kind of patience that belongs only to water and stone and deep time. Its surface caught the light of a crescent moon on this particular evening, breaking it into long ribbons of silver that stretched and dissolved and stretched again, over and over, as if the river were breathing in its sleep. And along its banks, where the reeds whispered in the faint breath of a late summer breeze, and the dark mud smelled richly of earth and roots and distant mountains, something was beginning, something that would, in time, fill the entire known world. You are standing, in your imagination, on the western bank of the Tiber River. The year, by the reckoning of scholars who came much later, is somewhere around 753 BCE. The people living here have no such number, no such way of naming a year. They know only the season. They feel the heat of summer softening, releasing its grip day by day, giving way to the first cool evenings of autumn, when the air carries the smell of ripening figs and dry grass and the particular sweetness of a landscape beginning to rest. The light falls long in gold across the low hills that rise from the flat river plain, hills that look, in this amber late afternoon glow, like the sleeping backs of enormous animals, unhurried and old and utterly at peace. There are 7 of these hills. You can see them from where you stand, each one gentle and rounded, none of them dramatic or imposing, all of them modest in the way that places tend to be before history discovers them. They are simply hills. They are covered in scrub oak and ilex and wild rosemary, and in the evenings, when the wind comes off the Tiber, you can smell the herbs crushed underfoot by grazing animals, a clean, sharp green scent that mingles with the river smell and the wood smoke curling up from somewhere higher on the nearest slope. This is where Rome begins, not with trumpets, not with marble columns shining in the sun or golden eagles borne aloft above the heads of marching legions. It begins here, in the quiet, beside this particular bend and this particular river, where a handful of hilltops offered safety from floods and enemies, and where the land was generous enough to feed the people who were willing to learn its rhythms. If you enjoy tonight's journey through history, subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now close your eyes and let's begin. There is a feeling that comes when you sit very still beside a river at night. The water moves whether you are watching it or not. It has its own agenda, its own patient relationship with gravity, its own conversation with the stones on its bed. The river does not know you are there. It does not need your attention to continue its long journey toward the sea. And yet something in us is drawn to moving water, especially in the dark, especially when the world is quiet. Something ancient in the human spirit recognizes in the river a companion, patient, constant, older than memory. The Tiber is that kind of river. It rises in the Apennine Mountains to the northeast, in a place of beech forests and cold springs, and it makes its long winding way southwest through the heart of what will one day be called Italy, gathering tributary streams as it goes, growing heavier and browner and more purposeful as it descends toward the coastal plain. By the time it reaches the 7 hills, it has traveled roughly 250 miles from its source. It carries with it the memory of those mountains, a faint mineral coolness that never entirely leaves the water, even in the height of summer. The Tiber is not a majestic river. It is not the Nile with its annual floods and its gift of black fertile soil spread across an entire civilization's farmland. It is not the Euphrates, wide and lordly, cradling great cities between its banks for thousands of years before Rome existed. The Tiber is a modest river, brownish and often turbid, prone to flooding its low banks in winter and running shallow and sluggish over its gravel beds in August. But it is perfectly, beautifully situated for what the people of this particular valley need. It is navigable from the sea, which lies roughly 20 miles to the southwest. Trading ships can come upriver on the tide and anchor in the wide bend below the hills. The river itself provides fresh water, fish, reeds for thatching and weaving, clay for making pottery and lining storage pits. The flat land on either side of the river is excellent for farming. The dark alluvial soil, deposited over thousands of years of seasonal flooding, is deep and rich and forgiving. And the hills themselves, rising just enough above the floodplain to stay dry in even the worst winters, provide natural defensive positions from which a community could watch the surrounding countryside and feel, if not entirely safe, at least forewarned. People understood these advantages long before anyone thought to call the place Rome. Archaeologists working patiently through the 20th and into the 21st century have found evidence of human settlement on the Palatine Hill, the most central and important of the seven, going back to the 10th century BCE and possibly earlier still. These were not Romans in any meaningful sense. They had no name for themselves that we know, no written language, no monumental architecture. They were Latin-speaking people, or Sabine, or perhaps the ancestors of both, sharing broadly similar languages and customs and ways of understanding the sky and the seasons and the proper way to honor the dead. They kept small herds of cattle and sheep. They grew emmer wheat in the flat fields beside the river. They harvested wild grapes and olives from the hillsides and learned, over generations, to encourage the best of these plants and to call the rest. They fished the Tiber with nets and bone hooks. They gathered mushrooms in the oak woods after autumn rain. They dried figs on flat stones in the September sun and stored their grain in pits lined with clay, sealed with lids weighted with stones, hidden against the long hunger of winter. And in the evenings, when the work was done, they sat around their fires in the small round huts they had built on the hilltops, and they told stories. We do not know what those stories were. They did not write them down because writing had not yet come to this part of the world. But we know they were there, those stories, because they always are. Every human community that has ever existed has gathered around its fire in the dark and made meaning out of experience through the act of telling. The stars above the Tiber hills on a clear autumn night would have been extraordinary in their brightness and their number. No city lights, no haze of pollution, just a pure black sky thick with more stars than you have ever seen or can quite imagine. Someone, on one of those evenings, pointed up and gave those stars their first names. Someone described the patterns they made and wove them into a story about gods and heroes and the origins of everything. And someone else listened and felt the fire warm on their face and the cool river air on their back, and drifted slowly into the particular peace that comes when a good story is being told and the night is not too cold and you are, for this moment, safe. That feeling, the warmth of the fire and the darkness beyond and the voice of the storyteller carrying you somewhere else, that is what we are reaching for tonight. The huts these early people built have long since vanished. They were made of materials that do not last, thin poles cut from the oak and ash trees of the hillsides, woven together and plastered with a mixture of clay and chopped straw that, when dried in the Italian sun, formed a surprisingly sturdy wall. The roofs were thatched with river reeds, layered thickly enough to shed the autumn rains, and inside, the floor was simply the earth itself, packed hard and smooth by the feet of many seasons. A single central hearth burned through the night, and the smoke rose through a gap in the thatch and disappeared into the Italian sky, and the smell of that smoke, of burning oak and perhaps dried herbs thrown onto the coals for fragrance or for ceremony, drifted out across the hillside and down toward the river below. We know these huts existed not because any account of them survived, but because the earth itself kept the record. When archaeologists dug carefully into the orange-brown soil of the Palatine Hill, they found something remarkable and quietly moving. The dark circles left in the ground where the supporting posts of those ancient huts had stood for years and then slowly rotted away. The posts themselves were gone. The walls were gone. The people were gone, every one of them, their names unrecorded, their faces unknown, their lives unreachable across the vast distance of 3,000 years. But the soil remembered the pressure of the posts. The earth held the shadows of their houses. There is something worth sitting within that. The ground beneath Rome is, in its own way, the most faithful historian of all. Long after everything built above the surface has crumbled or burned or been torn down and built again in a new form, the soil preserves its dark circles, its stains of ancient fires, its ghost outlines of floors that human feet crossed every morning before the sun was fully up, crossed again at midday coming in from the fields, crossed for the last time each night before sleep took the household down into its own version of the quiet dark. Those circles in the soil of the Palatine Hill are called the Capin Romaine by Italian archaeologists, the huts of Rome. They date to the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, and they represent the oldest unambiguous physical evidence of the community that would eventually become the eternal city. They are modest evidence, nothing more than shadows. But they are real. The story of Rome begins with shadows in the earth and wood smoke drifting above a river in the last warmth of an Italian summer. And from that quiet beginning, Everything flows. Let us go a little further back before we come forward again. Let us climb to a higher place and see the landscape more fully, because Rome did not arise in isolation. It arose in the middle of a world that was already old and layered and complex, a world of competing peoples and ancient trade routes and gods with long memories. The Italian peninsula in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE was a place of remarkable diversity. Along the western coastal plain, the Etruscans were building the foundations of what would become one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Roman Mediterranean. They were master metalworkers and traders, their cities linked by roads and their ports busy with ships from Greece in the Near East and Carthage on the North African coast. Etruscan art from this period, found in tombs that have been carefully excavated over the last 2 centuries, shows a people of refined tastes and considerable wealth. People who loved music and feasting and athletic competition, who decorated their burial chambers with vivid paintings of dancers and musicians and the pleasures of a life they clearly hoped would continue in some form beyond death. The Latin word for the settlement was a simple one in the beginning. Communities in ancient Latium were called oppida, fortified hilltop settlements, and each one had its own local identity, its own patron deity, its own relationships of kinship and alliance with its neighbors. The community on the Palatine would have been one of several such settlements in the immediate area, each one occupying a different hill or ridge, each one farming its own portion of the river plain, each one negotiating through the complicated social landscape of gift-giving and marriage alliance and occasional conflict that characterized life in this part of the world. The Sabine people lived on the hills just to the north and east. They spoke a language related to Latin but distinct enough to mark them as a different people, and the boundary between the Latin communities on the Palatine and the Sabine communities on the Quirinal and Esquiline hills would have been a zone of both contact and tension. Trade goods moved across it. Young people from one community sometimes married into another, and occasionally, in the way of all human communities that share resources and boundaries, there was conflict. And in the evenings, when the work was done, they sat around their fires in the small round huts they had built on the hilltops, and they told stories. We do not know what those stories were. They did not write them down because writing had not yet come to this part of the world. But we know they were there, those stories, because they always are. Every human community that has ever existed has gathered around its fire in the dark and made meaning out of experience through the act of telling. The stars above the Tiber hills on a clear autumn night would have been extraordinary in their brightness and their number. No city lights, no haze of pollution, just a pure black sky thick with more stars than you have ever seen or can quite imagine. Someone, on one of those evenings, pointed up and gave those stars their first names. Someone described the patterns they made and wove them into a story about gods and heroes and the origins of everything. And someone else listened and felt the fire warm on their face and the cool river air on their back, and drifted slowly into the particular peace that comes when a good story is being told and the night is not too cold and you are, for this moment, safe. That feeling, the warmth of the fire and the darkness beyond and the voice of the storyteller carrying you somewhere else, that is what we are reaching for tonight. The huts these early people built have long since vanished. They were made of materials that do not last, thin poles cut from the oak and ash trees of the hillsides, woven together and plastered with a mixture of clay and chopped straw that, when dried in the Italian sun, formed a surprisingly sturdy wall. The roofs were thatched with river reeds, layered thickly enough to shed the autumn rains, and inside, the floor was simply the earth itself, packed hard and smooth by the feet of many seasons. A single central hearth burned through the night, and the smoke rose through a gap in the thatch and disappeared into the Italian sky, and the smell of that smoke, of burning oak and perhaps dried herbs thrown onto the coals for fragrance or for ceremony, drifted out across the hillside and down toward the river below. We know these huts existed not because any account of them survived, but because the earth itself kept the record. When archaeologists dug carefully into the orange-brown soil of the Palatine Hill, they found something remarkable and quietly moving. The dark circles left in the ground where the supporting posts of those ancient huts had stood for years and then slowly rotted away. The posts themselves were gone. The walls were gone. The people were gone, every one of them, their names unrecorded, their faces unknown, their lives unreachable across the vast distance of 3,000 years. But the soil remembered the pressure of the posts. The earth held the shadows of their houses. There is something worth sitting within that. The ground beneath Rome is, in its own way, the most faithful historian of all. Long after everything built above the surface has crumbled or burned or been torn down and built again in a new form, the soil preserves its dark circles, its stains of ancient fires, its ghost outlines of floors that human feet crossed every morning before the sun was fully up, crossed again at midday coming in from the fields, crossed for the last time each night before sleep took the household down into its own version of the quiet dark. Those circles in the soil of the Palatine Hill are called the Capin Romaine by Italian archaeologists, the huts of Rome. They date to the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, and they represent the oldest unambiguous physical evidence of the community that would eventually become the Eternal City. They are modest evidence, nothing more than shadows. But they are real. The story of Rome begins with shadows in the earth and wood smoke drifting above a river in the last warmth of an Italian summer. And from that quiet beginning, everything flows. Let us go a little further back before we come forward again. Let us climb to a higher place and see the landscape more fully, because Rome did not arise in isolation. It arose in the middle of a world that was already old and layered and complex, a world of competing peoples and ancient trade routes and gods with long memories. The Italian peninsula in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE was a place of remarkable diversity. Along the western coastal plain, the Etruscans were building the foundations of what would become one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Roman Mediterranean. They were master metalworkers and traders, their cities linked by roads and their ports busy with ships from Greece in the Near East and Carthage on the North African coast. Etruscan art from this period, found in tombs that have been carefully excavated over the last 2 centuries, shows a people of refined tastes and considerable wealth. People who loved music and feasting and athletic competition, who decorated their burial chambers with vivid paintings of dancers and musicians and the pleasures of a life they clearly hoped would continue in some form beyond death. The Latin word for the settlement was a simple one in the beginning. Communities in ancient Latium were called oppida, fortified hilltop settlements, and each one had its own local identity, its own patron deity, its own relationships of kinship and alliance with its neighbors. The community on the Palatine would have been one of several such settlements in the immediate area, each one occupying a different hill or ridge, each one farming its own portion of the river plain, each one negotiating through the complicated social landscape of gift-giving and marriage alliance and occasional conflict that characterized life in this part of the world. The Sabine people lived on the hills just to the north and east. They spoke a language related to Latin but distinct enough to mark them as a different people. And the boundary between the Latin communities on the Palatine and the Sabine communities on the Quirinal and Esquiline hills would have been a zone of both contact and tension. Trade goods moved across it. Young people from one community sometimes married into another. And occasionally, in the way of all human communities that share resources and boundaries, there was conflict. The myth of Rome's founding, the story the Romans themselves told and retold and elaborated and argued about for centuries, is one of the most beautiful and strange origin stories in the ancient world. Like all great origin stories, it is layered. It has been told and retold, added to and subtracted from, by so many generations that peeling it back to any original version is probably impossible and, in any case, would miss the point. What matters about an origin story is not whether it is literally true but what it reveals about the people who tell it. What does this story say about how Romans understood themselves? What did they believe about their own nature, their own destiny, their own relationship to the gods and to the vast sweep of time? The story begins, as so many Roman stories begin, very far from Rome. It begins with Troy. You know Troy, or you know its myth, which for our purposes tonight is the same thing. The great walled city on the western coast of Asia Minor, the city of Priam and Hector and beautiful Helen. The city that burned after 10 years of the war that the ancient Greeks told stories about for centuries. When Troy fell, according to the tradition that the Romans inherited and cherished, one hero survived the flames and the slaughter. His name was Aeneas. He was the son of the mortal Anchises and the goddess Venus herself, which meant that he carried in his blood a mixture of the human and the divine, and which meant, in the logic of ancient mythology, that he was protected by the gods even when everything around him was destruction and death. Aeneas, according to the poet Virgil who told this story most completely in his great epic the Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE but drawing on traditions much older, carried his elderly father Anchises on his back as he fled through the burning streets of Troy. He held his young son Ascanius by the hand. He gathered what survivors he could find in the chaos of the city's last night, and he led them out through the burning gates, down to the shore, onto whatever ships remained, and away into the darkness of the sea. The journey that followed was long and hard and full of the kind of suffering that, in the ancient world, was understood to be the necessary price of founding something great. There were storms sent by hostile gods. There were strange islands and dangerous coasts. There was a stop in Carthage, that beautiful city on the North African shore, where the Queen Dido fell deeply in love with Aeneas and where Aeneas spent a winter of warmth and comfort and forgetting, until the gods reminded him of his destiny and he left quietly in the night, and Dido in her grief built a pyre and burned, and the light of that fire was, according to the story, the last thing Aeneas saw of Africa as his fleet pulled away in the dawn. At last, after many years and many losses, Aeneas and his people arrived on the western coast of Italy, in the region that would later be called Latium. Here, after wars and alliances and the complicated political negotiations that always accompany the arrival of refugees in an already inhabited landscape, Aeneas made peace with the Latin king Latinus. He married Latinus's daughter Lavinia. He founded a city called Lavinium, named for his new wife, and he began the line of descent that would eventually lead, through many generations of kings ruling in the city of Alba Longa in the Alban hills south of the Tiber, to the two young men at the very center of Rome's founding story. Historians are careful, and rightly so, to note that Aeneas and his Trojan refugees are mythology, not history. There is no archaeological evidence for a Trojan colony at the mouth of the Tiber. The story of Aeneas arriving in Italy is a narrative construction, most likely assembled in its full form during the period of the Roman Republic, when educated Romans were deeply engaged with Greek literary culture and eager to connect their own history to the great heroic traditions of the Hellenic world. But to say the story is mythological is not to say it is meaningless. Origin stories are never arbitrary. They are always, in some deep sense, true, not factually true, but emotionally and culturally true. When the Romans claimed descent from Aeneas, they were saying something specific and important about themselves. They were saying, "We are ancient. Our roots reach back to the oldest heroic age of the Mediterranean world. We are not newcomers or barbarians or people without a past. We are the heirs of Troy, which means we are heirs to something that the whole civilized world already knows and respects. We belong here. We have always belonged here. The gods themselves brought us to this river and this valley and these hills, and what we build here is therefore not accident but destiny." That is a remarkable thing to believe about yourself. It is the kind of belief that, held firmly enough, over enough generations, in enough people, has a way of making itself true. From Aeneas, then, the ancient sources trace a line of kings ruling at Alba Longa for roughly 300 years, a span of time that historians recognize as suspiciously round and likely telescoped, but which serves its narrative purpose of bridging the mythological age of Troy with the historical founding of Rome. The last king of this line who matters for our story is a man named Numitor, and his story is one of those compressed family tragedies that the ancient world was very good at telling. Numitor was the rightful king of Alba Longa. He had a brother named Amulius. Amulius, in the way of younger brothers in the tales of ancient kings, was not content with what fate had given him. He deposed Numitor. He took the throne for himself. And to ensure that Numitor's line could not threaten him, he disposed of Numitor's sons and consecrated Numitor's daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, as a Vestal virgin, bound to the goddess Vesta and to celibacy, safe in the sacred order where no one would expect her to produce heirs. Amulius thought he had been thorough. He thought he had closed every door through which his brother's line might return. He had not reckoned with the gods. Rhea Silvia, according to the ancient sources, and here we are deep in the territory of myth, as the Romans themselves sometimes acknowledged, was visited by the god Mars. She became pregnant. She bore twin sons. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent about the details of this pregnancy, and historians note that the divine paternity is almost certainly a mythological addition, a way of explaining the extraordinary nature of what followed. But what the story is saying beneath its divine machinery is something very human and very old, that the power of legitimate descent cannot be entirely suppressed, that nature finds its way around even the most careful political management, that the future does not always cooperate with the plans of those who think they control it. When Emilius learned of the twins' birth, he ordered them killed. This was, in the ancient world, the standard solution to unwanted royal heirs, especially very young ones. But the servant or soldier tasked with drowning the infants, the story varies in its details, could not bring himself to do it. Perhaps he pitied them. Perhaps he feared the gods more than he feared Emilius. Perhaps he simply could not look into the faces of two sleeping newborns and choose to end them. He placed them in a basket. He set the basket on the flooding waters of the Tiber. He let the river decide. The river carried them. The waters of the Tiber were high that season, the annual winter floods that turned the river brown and wide and slow, spreading across the low fields on either side and depositing the rich silt that made the Roman plains so fertile. The basket drifted on the current, past the reeds and the willow trees, past the flat gravel bars where egrets stood in the shallows, past the wooded banks where the oak trees hung their bare winter branches over the moving water. And when the flood waters began to recede, the basket came to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill, caught in the roots of a fig tree that grew at the hill's base, a tree the Romans would later call the Ficus ruminalis and consider sacred for the rest of their history. There, according to the most famous part of the founding story, a she-wolf found them. She had come down to the river to drink, as wolves do on quiet mornings when the world is still and the water is calm, and she found instead two crying infants in a basket among the fig tree's roots. She nursed them. She kept them warm with her body. She returned to them day after day, bringing them the wild milk that sustained them through the days before a human shepherd named Faustulus discovered them and brought them to his wife Acca Laurentia, who raised them as her own children. The she-wolf nursing the infants is perhaps the single most enduring image in all of Roman mythology. You know it even if you have never consciously thought about it. The bronze sculpture known as the Capitoline wolf, with her lean body and her fierce upturned head and her two small human children suckling beneath her. The sculpture that most people know, the one in the Capitoline museums in Rome, is actually a medieval work, probably of the 11th or 12th century CE, with the two infants added by the sculptor Antonio Pagliulo in the 15th century. The ancient Romans had their own versions of the wolf and the twins in bronze and terracotta and stone, displayed in prominent places throughout the city, carried in processions, reproduced on coins. The image was everywhere because it carried everything the Romans wanted to say about themselves. They were nurtured by a wolf, by the wild, by the fierce, untamed, milk-giving power of nature itself. They were children of the forest as much as children of the gods. There was something in them that was savage and direct and entirely without pretension, something that had been fed at the breast of a creature that acknowledged no master and feared nothing and survived by its own strength in a world that was beautiful and dangerous and merciless and alive. That wolf was always somewhere in the Roman character, lying just beneath the marble and the law and the philosophical discourse, if you knew how to look. The twins grew up in the household of Faustulus the shepherd, on the slopes of the Palatine Hill, among the other young men and boys who herded cattle and sheep in the rough country along the Tiber. They were, by all accounts that the ancient sources preserve, remarkable young men, strong and bold and natural leaders, the kind of people around whom others gathered without quite being able to say why. Their names were Romulus and Remus. They got into trouble, as young men on the edges of society tend to do. They led raids on the neighboring Sabine people. They intercepted bandits who were plundering the local herdsmen. They gathered around themselves a loose band of followers, other young men with nothing much to lose and a taste for adventure and the particular aimless energy of youth before it finds its purpose. Eventually, through a sequence of events that the ancient sources describe with considerable drama, the twins' true identity was revealed. Remus was captured by men serving Emilius and brought before the king. The old King Numitor, seeing Remus and recognizing something in the young man's bearing that reminded him of things long lost, began to ask questions. Romulus came to rescue his brother with a group of armed followers. Emilius was killed. Numitor was restored to the throne of Alba Longa. And the twins, still young, still restless, found themselves at a crossroads. They could have settled in Alba Longa. They could have taken positions of honor in their grandfather's court and lived out comfortable lives as princes of an established city. But they didn't want that. Something in them, that wolf-fed wildness, that taste for open land in their own authority, pointed them back toward the Tiber, back toward the hills where they had grown up, back toward that particular place on the river's edge that felt, to them, like home. They decided to found a new city. And here the story arrives at its most famous crisis, the crisis that every Roman child knew and every Roman historian wrestled with, the crisis that cast its long shadow across the entire subsequent history of the city. The brothers could not agree on which hill the city should be built on. Romulus wanted the Palatine. Remus preferred the Aventine, the longer ridge that lay to the south, closer to the river. Each of them claimed signs from the gods supporting their choice. The ancient method of reading such signs was augury, the observation of birds, particularly their number and their flight patterns, understood as communications from the divine world to the human. Remus, looking from the Aventine, claimed to have seen 6 vultures, a favorable omen. Romulus, watching from the Palatine, claimed to have seen 12, double the omen, twice the divine endorsement. We don't know exactly what happened next. The ancient sources give us different versions, each one reflecting the storyteller's particular concerns and the audience they were speaking to. What we know is the outcome. There was a quarrel. In some versions, Romulus had already begun to mark out the boundary of his new city, the sacred furrow plowed by a white bull and a white cow, defining the line within which the city would stand and beyond which nothing impure could enter. And Remus, in mockery or in anger or in some complicated mixture of both, jumped over that furrow. In the logic of sacred boundary making, this was not a minor transgression. The boundary of a new city was holy. Crossing it uninvited was an act of desecration. And the penalty that the ancient world associated with such desecration was death. Romulus killed his brother. Some versions say it was with his own hands. Others say it was done by one of Romulus's followers while Romulus stood by. Some say words were spoken, a declaration that this is what will happen to anyone who crosses these walls. However it happened, Remus died at the boundary of the new city. And Romulus, now alone with his destiny, went on to build Rome. He wept, some sources say. He built the city and he wept for the brother he had killed at its foundations, and for the rest of his life that grief sat somewhere in him, unresolved and unspeakable. Whether this detail is true or mythological or both, it captures something about the strange and violent nature of the founding moment. The idea that great things are sometimes built over losses that can never be fully mourned, that the cost of creation can be terrible, and that the founder of the most powerful city in the ancient world was, at his city's birth, a man standing alone at the edge of a furrow with blood on his hands and a kingdom ahead of him and no one left to share it with. The date the Romans themselves settled on for this founding was April 21st, 753 BCE. They were probably wrong, as the Romans sometimes acknowledged. The archaeological evidence suggests a more gradual process of community formation over several centuries, rather than a single dramatic founding moment. But the Romans were not unusual in needing a founding story, a specific day and hour when the city came into being, a moment around which all subsequent history could be organized. Every great city tells itself a story about its beginning, and what matters about that story is not its accuracy but its meaning. Rome's founding story says, "We began with violence and with love and with a sacred boundary that could not be uncrossed. We began with a wolf and a river and a determination to build something here, on these modest hills, that had never existed before. We began in grief and in ambition and in the terrible loneliness of the first morning after a great loss. But we began, and from that beginning everything followed. Let the night deepen a little now. Let the stars above the Palatine Hill grow brighter as the sky darkens fully from the deep blue of late evening to the rich black of the genuine night. The Tiber is quiet below. There are fires burning on the hilltop, small and warm and orange, and around those fires the first people of Rome, whoever they were, whatever they called themselves in those early generations, are gathered as humans have always gathered around fire, drawn to its light and its warmth and the way it holds the darkness back just far enough to make a space for life and story and the long conversation that never quite ends. The founding of the city, whether it happened in a single dramatic moment or through the slow accumulation of decades, set in motion a process that would unfold over the next 2.5 centuries in ways that nobody in those early generations could possibly have foreseen. The period historians call the regal period, the age of Rome's kings, lasted, according to the traditional Roman chronology, from 753 BCE to 509 BCE. There were, by that tradition, 7 kings in all. Romulus was the first. The last was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose overthrow by a coalition of Roman aristocrats ended the monarchy and began the Republic. Between those two, 5 more kings ruled in succession, each one associated in the Roman historical imagination with specific institutions, specific buildings, specific elements of Roman religious and civic life. How much of this is history and how much is myth is a question that has occupied scholars for centuries. The honest answer is, we don't entirely know. The Romans had no contemporary written records from this period. The earliest Roman historians were writing in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, looking back at events that had occurred 200, 300, 400 years before their time, working from oral traditions and ancient ritual practices and the faint physical traces of an earlier Rome that had been largely destroyed and rebuilt in the aftermath of a catastrophic Gallic sack of the city in 390 BCE. The picture they assembled was probably a mixture of genuine historical memory, deliberate political mythology, and simple, honest uncertainty dressed up in narrative confidence. But the picture they assembled has come down to us, and it is rich and strange and full of the particular texture of a world that was very old and yet very new, a world in which the border between the human and the divine was far more permeable than anything we might recognize from our own experience, a world in which every natural event had a name and a personality and an agenda, and in which the proper management of relationships with the gods was the most serious business any community could undertake. Romulus, the first king, is credited in the ancient sources with a series of founding acts that established the basic structure of the community. He divided the male population into 2 groups: the patricians, the noble families whose ancestors had supposedly been present at the founding and who would form the aristocratic core of Roman society for centuries, and the plebeians, the common people, the majority, who worked the land and filled the army and whose relationship with the patricians would be one of the central tensions of Roman history for the next several hundred years. Romulus also created the Senate, the Council of Elders, originally 100 men whose collective wisdom would advise the king and whose authority would be the foundation of Roman governance long after the kings were gone. The word senator comes from the Latin senex, meaning old man, and the Senate was in its earliest form exactly what the word suggests: a gathering of the elder men of the most important families, the people who had lived long enough to know the history of the community and the weight of the decisions that needed to be made on its behalf. And Romulus, according to a tradition that historians find both intriguing and difficult to evaluate, created the Sellers, the Swift Ones, a force of 300 mounted warriors who served as the king's personal guard and in time as the military elite of the early Roman state. Whether this represents a historical institution or a mythological attribution, the details are significant. 300 men chosen for speed and skill, personally loyal to the king, the beginning of a military tradition that would eventually produce the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen. But Romulus also faced a problem that any founder of a new city faces. He had people, men mostly drawn from the surrounding hills and valleys by the promise of a fresh start, by the energy of a new enterprise, by the particular magnetism of a charismatic leader who seemed to believe that what he was building was destined for greatness. But he did not have enough women. A community without women cannot reproduce itself. A city without families cannot endure. The solution the Roman tradition attributes to Romulus is one of the most famous episodes in all of Roman mythology, and one of the most uncomfortable to modern sensibilities: the rape of the Sabine women. Let us take a moment here to be precise about language and about history. The Latin word that appears in the ancient sources, raptio, does not mean rape in the modern sense of sexual violation. It means abduction, forcible seizure. The Sabine women who were taken were, according to the tradition, taken to be wives, not to be assaulted. This distinction matters for understanding what the Romans themselves thought they were describing, even as we recognize that the seizure of women without their consent is, by any modern standard, a profound violation of human dignity and autonomy. The The story goes like this. Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine communities to a great festival, a religious celebration in honor of the god Consus, with games and feasting and the general goodwill that religious occasions were supposed to generate. The Sabines came with their families, and at a signal from Romulus, the Roman men seized the young Sabine women and carried them off, while the unarmed Sabine men were driven away. What followed, in the ancient telling, was more nuanced than the initial act. The Roman men who had seized the women reportedly treated them with respect, assured them that they were honored wives and not slaves, and eventually genuine marriages and genuine affections developed. When the Sabine men organized a military campaign to recover their women, the women themselves intervened, throwing themselves between their fathers and brothers on one side and their Roman husbands on the other, begging both parties to stop fighting, arguing that they had accepted their situation and did not want to see the people they loved killing each other. The result was not the defeat of one side by the other, but a merger. The Sabine king Titus Tatius came to an agreement with Romulus, and the two peoples united under joint kingship, with the Sabines bringing their population and their traditions into the growing community on the Palatine. The Sabine families became Roman families. The Sabine gods entered the Roman pantheon. And the community at the bend of the Tiber grew, in a single generation, from a collection of Latin settlers to a mixed Latin Sabine population that was, by the standards of the ancient world, quite sizable. Historians view the rape of the Sabine women as a mythological explanation for what was probably a more gradual historical process, the integration of the Latin and Sabine communities of the Roman hills into a single political unit. The violence of the story may encode a memory of actual conflict between these communities, or it may simply be the ancient storyteller's way of dramatizing a transition that was, in reality, more complicated and less clearly defined. What is certain is that by the early historical period, Roman society was a genuine mixture of Latin and Sabine elements, and that the Romans were aware of this and had stories to explain it. The Sabine heritage was something Romans took seriously. Many of the most distinguished Roman families of the historical period traced their origins to Sabine ancestors. The Sabines were associated, in the Roman imagination, with a particular set of virtues: simplicity, austerity, old-fashioned honesty, the uncorrupted morality of people who had not yet been softened by luxury and wealth. Even centuries later, when Rome had become the greatest city in the world and was drowning in the products of its own empire, moralists and philosophers would point to the Sabine heritage as a reminder of what Romans were supposed to be at their core: plain-spoken, hard-working, devoted to family and duty and the proper worship of the gods. That image, the honest Sabine farmer with his rough hands and his clear eyes and his complete indifference to the seductions of wealth, became a permanent part of the Roman ideal, even as Roman reality moved further and further from it. It was a useful myth, the kind that any society needs, a memory of a simpler, more virtuous past that can be invoked when the present seems to have lost its way. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, the second king, and where Romulus had been all motion and violence and the sharp edge of founding, Numa was stillness and religion and the patient work of putting a soul into the city that had been built. Numa was Sabine by birth, chosen by the Senate to rule after Romulus, who, according to the ancient tradition, had been taken up into the heavens during a thunderstorm and deified as the god Quirinus. The Romans themselves were somewhat skeptical of this convenient disappearance, and some ancient sources quietly note that there were those who suspected the Senate had arranged Romulus's removal more decisively. But the official story was the thunderstorm and the apotheosis, and Romulus became Quirinus, and a temple was eventually built to him on the Quirinal Hill, and Romans made offerings there for centuries, because a city's founder, once consecrated as a god, becomes an endless resource for civic identity and divine protection. Numa, by contrast, never became a god. He ruled for 43 years, according to the tradition, a long, quiet, apparently peaceful reign during which, the ancient sources tell us, there was not a single war. This is probably too clean and too perfect to be entirely historical, but it captures something true about the contrast the Romans drew between their first two kings: Romulus for war, Numa for peace; Romulus for the city's bones, Numa for its spirit; Romulus for the law of the sword, Numa for the law of the gods. It was Numa who organized Rome's religious calendar, fixing the days of religious observance and distinguishing between the dies fasti, days on which ordinary business could be conducted, and the dies nefasti, days sacred to the gods, on which courts were closed and public business suspended. This distinction between sacred and secular time was fundamental to Roman thinking, and it endured in various forms for the entire history of Rome and beyond. It was Numa who established the great priestly colleges that would organize Roman religious life for centuries, the pontiffs who had authority over religious law, the augurs who read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the behavior of sacred chickens, the officiales who managed the religious dimensions of war and diplomacy, ensuring that Rome's wars were, in the eyes of the gods, just wars undertaken with proper ceremony. These colleges were not simply ceremonial institutions. They were, in the Roman system, the guardians of the relationship between the city and the divine forces that sustained it, the professionals whose knowledge of the proper forms and proper words kept the machinery of cosmic order running smoothly. Numa was also said to have received divine guidance directly, in his case from the Nymphagiriae, who met with him by night in a sacred grove near the city and told him the laws and rituals that he then presented to the Roman people. Historians recognize Egeria as another mythological element, a divine counselor who authorizes the human leader's innovations by connecting them to something beyond human origin. But the tradition reveals something important about how the Romans understood legislation and religious reform. It needed divine authorization. It was not enough for a king, even a wise one, to say, "These are the rules I am imposing." The rules had to come from somewhere beyond the merely human. They had to be given, received, recognized, not invented. This is a deeply conservative way of thinking about law and religion, and it explains a great deal about the Roman character. The Romans were, at their core, a deeply conservative people. They venerated tradition. They preserved ancient rituals whose original meanings had been lost for centuries, performing them anyway because the performance itself was the continuity with a past that sustained the present. They were suspicious of innovation, of anything claimed to be new, of anyone who said, simply on their own authority, that things should be done differently. Change in the Roman system required legitimation. It had to be shown to be not really change at all, but a return to something ancient and correct that had been temporarily obscured. This conservatism would become both one of Rome's greatest strengths and one of its most persistent challenges. A society that trusts its accumulated tradition can maintain coherence across enormous spans of time and space. A society that cannot admit the legitimacy of genuine change eventually breaks under the weight of problems that tradition cannot address. Rome would wrestle with that tension for its entire history. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, the third king, and with Tullus the city returned to war. Under Tullus, Rome fought and defeated Alba Longa, the mother city from which the Roman founding line had supposedly descended. The destruction of Alba Longa and the incorporation of its population into Rome was a significant moment in the early city's expansion, and it was accompanied, in the ancient tradition, by one of the most dramatic episodes of the early regal period. The conflict between Rome and Alba Longa was, according to the tradition, resolved by a form of combat that substituted for a full-scale battle. A contest between 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, and 3 Alban brothers, the Curiatii. 3 against 3, the winner to decide which city would dominate the other. The story of the battle between these brothers, 2 Horatii killed, all 3 Curiatii wounded, and the surviving Horatius killing each of his wounded opponents in turn by feigning retreat and forcing them to pursue separately, became one of the most celebrated tales of Roman military virtue, painted and sculpted and retold across 2,000 years. What historians make of this story is mixed. The specific details of the combat are almost certainly legendary, but the episode of Alba Longa's destruction carries within it a genuine historical memory. Rome in the 7th century BCE was expanding. It was absorbing neighboring communities. It was growing larger and more complex and more powerful than any of the other Latin cities in its immediate vicinity, and that process of growth was not always peaceful. Under the 4th king, Ancus Marcius, who was said to be the grandson of Numa Pompilius, bringing the Sabine piety of the 2nd king back into the royal line, Rome extended its territory to the sea. Ancus founded the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, or at least so the tradition claims, and the ability to control both the river trade route and the seaport where it met the Mediterranean gave Rome an economic importance that reinforced its political and military growth. The fifth king was the first to come from outside the Latin and Sabine communities entirely. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Tarquin the Elder, and he was, according to the ancient sources, the son of an immigrant from the Etruscan city of Corinth, a man who had come to the Etruscan city of Tarquinia and settled there, eventually fathering a son who found his ambitions too large for the confines of his adopted city and moved south to Rome, where opportunity lay. With the Tarquins, Rome enters a new phase. The Etruscans were, in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the dominant civilization of central Italy. Their cities, Tarquinia, Veii, Caira, Volsci, Populonia, and the others, were wealthy and sophisticated, their culture a rich synthesis of local tradition and influences from Greece and the Near East. Etruscan art from this period is extraordinary. The painted tombs of Tarquinia with their banqueting scenes and their musicians and their hunting parties. The golden jewelry that Etruscan craftsmen made with a delicacy and precision that even modern goldsmiths struggle to replicate. The bronze sculpture, bold and expressive. The architecture, monumental in its ambitions even when its materials were relatively humble. The Etruscans brought to Rome, during the century and a half of Etruscan kings, a cultural transformation that left permanent marks. They brought urban planning, the organized layout of streets and public spaces that turned the scattered hilltop villages of early Rome into something approaching a real city. They built the Great Drain called the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, an engineering achievement that channeled the waters of the marshy valley between the hills into the Tiber and made the low-lying forum area not just habitable but usable as a central public space. The Cloaca Maxima, built in the 6th century BCE and continuously maintained and extended, still flows beneath modern Rome, still carrying the city's water to the Tiber, one of the longest continuously functioning pieces of infrastructure in human history. The Etruscans brought the temple. Before Etruscan influence, Roman religious sites were probably sacred groves and open-air altars. Natural settings marked as holy by tradition and maintained by the priestly colleges but without permanent architectural expression. The Etruscan tradition of building temples to house divine images, raised on high podia and approached by flights of stairs, fronted by deep porches with painted terracotta decorations, transformed the religious landscape of Rome. The great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, Rome's central religious monument, dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, was begun, according to the tradition, by Tarquinius Priscus and completed under the last of the Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Superbus, and dedicated at the very beginning of the Republic in 509 BCE. It was the largest temple in Italy at the time of its construction. A statement in stone and terracotta and gilded decoration that Rome was no longer a village but a city that intended to be taken seriously by gods and mortals alike. The Etruscans brought the triumph, the spectacular military procession in which a victorious general entered Rome in a chariot painted red, wearing the toga picta and the golden crown, his face painted red to match Jupiter's cult statue, his soldiers following behind singing songs that were, by tradition, permitted to mock their general as freely as they liked. The triumph was one of the most distinctively Roman institutions, and its roots in Etruscan royal and religious ceremony are now generally accepted by historians. They brought the fasces, those bundles of rods tied around an axe that were carried before high magistrates as symbols of the state's power to command, to punish, and to execute. The fasces, so deeply associated in later history with Roman authority that they became the symbol of an entire 20th century political movement that took its very name from them, were Etruscan in origin, adopted by Rome when it adopted the political forms of its more sophisticated northern neighbors. The transformation of Rome under Etruscan influence was not simply a matter of borrowing foreign forms. It was a genuine cultural revolution, a remaking of what the city was and what it was capable of being. The Rome that emerged from the 6th century BCE, with its drained forum and its grand temples and its organized street plan and its formal political institutions, was a different kind of place than the Rome of the 8th and 7th centuries. It was, for the first time, something that contemporaries in the wider Mediterranean world might recognize as a city. Tarquinius Priscus was succeeded by the 6th king, Servius Tullius, whose reign the ancient sources present as a kind of second founding, a reorganization of the Roman state so fundamental that it established the constitutional framework that would govern the city for the next several centuries. Servius Tullius created the census. He organized the Roman population into classes based on wealth, assigning each class specific military obligations and specific political rights. The wealthiest class, the equestrians and the first class of infantry, contributed the most soldiers and the heaviest armor and had the greatest say in the popular assemblies. The poorest class, the proletarians, contributed mainly their children to the state and had minimal political voice. This was, by modern standards, a profoundly unequal system. By the standards of the ancient world, it was a rational attempt to match political power to military contribution in a society where the citizen soldier was the basis of the army and where the question of who fought was inseparable from the question of who governed. The census Servius created was not simply a military and political tool. It was also a religious act. The census was completed by a ceremony of ritual purification called the lustrum, in which the entire Roman people was symbolically cleansed and presented as a corporate body to the gods. The lustratio, the purification, was performed by the sacrifice of a pig, a sheep, and a bull, led 3 times around the assembled army in a great circle, the circle representing completeness and protection. This ceremony, the suiviturilia, was one of the most ancient and persistent elements of Roman religious practice, performed not just at the census but on many other occasions of public purification throughout Roman history. Servius also built the Servian Wall, a defensive circuit of earthworks and fortifications that enclosed, for the first time, all 7 hills within a single perimeter. Or so the tradition claims. Archaeologists have shown that the substantial stone wall that can still be seen in several places in modern Rome actually dates from the 4th century BC, after the Gallic sack. But some form of earlier fortification probably did exist, and the tradition of attributing it to Servius reflects the deep impression his reign made on the Roman memory. He was the king who defined the boundary of the city, who said, "This far extends Rome and no further," who drew a line in the earth and made it sacred. The 6th king's murder by his own daughter and son-in-law brings the regal period to its darkest and most dramatic episode. Servius Tullius was killed, according to the ancient tradition, by the conspiracy of his son-in-law Tarquinius Superbus and his own daughter Tullia, who wanted the throne and were willing to commit parricide to take it. The murder was brutal. Servius was struck down in the street and Tullia, driving her chariot through the city streets, ordered her driver to pass over her father's bleeding body rather than stop for it. The street where this supposedly occurred was ever afterward called the Vicus Celeraeus, the street of crime, and the name endured in Roman geography as a permanent memorial to the moment when ambition overrode every human restraint. Tarquinius Superbus, the proud, or the arrogant, depending on your translation, became the 7th and last king of Rome. His reign is presented in the ancient sources as a tyranny in the classical Greek sense. A rule that began in crime, was sustained by fear, and ended in expulsion. He accumulated power in his own hands, bypassed the Senate, ignored traditional Roman governance, and made himself the kind of king that the Roman aristocratic tradition had always feared and always, eventually, produced a violent reaction against. His fall came from his family's abuse of a woman named Lucretia. Lucretia was the wife of a Roman nobleman named Collatinus, and she was, by all accounts that the ancient sources preserve, a woman of exceptional virtue and dignity in the Roman style. Chaste, modest, devoted to her household, working at her loom late into the night while the wives of other noble Romans were feasting and entertaining themselves. She was, in the Roman imagination, the ideal Roman matron, and her violation by Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, was therefore not simply a private crime but an assault on everything Rome was supposed to stand for. After the assault, Lucretia summoned her father and her husband. She told them what had happened. She made them swear to avenge her. And then she took a knife and killed herself, because for a Roman woman of her time and her understanding of honor, a life lived after such violation was not a life she could accept. Her body, carried through the streets of Rome and displayed to the Roman people by the nobleman Lucius Junius Brutus, became the instrument of revolution. The Roman people, outraged and shamed, drove out the Tarquins. The monarchy was abolished. And in its place, the Romans created the institution that would define and carry their civilization for the next 5 centuries, the Republic. Let the night settle more deeply now. The story has moved through a long time in many lives, from the shadows in the Palatine soil to the great temples of the 6th century city, from the she-wolf nursing 2 infants by the river to the expulsion of a king whose crimes had become intolerable. We have covered nearly 250 years in the soft light of a single evening, and the air around you is growing cooler now, the kind of cool that comes when the night has fully arrived and the stars are at their highest and the world has grown still. There is more to tell. There always is. The story of how Rome became Rome is inexhaustible, and we have only reached its early chapters. But let us slow down now. Let us linger in this particular moment, the moment just after the kings and just before the Republic, the moment when Rome was poised on the edge of its own future. The city at the end of the regal period was a remarkable place. Archaeologists can give us a sense of what it looked like, though the picture will always be incomplete. The Forum, that marshy valley that had first served as a burial ground between the Palatine and the Esquiline, had been drained and paved and transformed into the central public space of the city. Around its edges, temples and shrines stood on high platforms, their colored terracotta decorations bright against the Italian sky. The great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline was under construction or newly completed, its white walls and golden ornaments visible from the surrounding hills. The streets were unpaved in most areas, narrow and winding, following paths that had been worn by feet and hooves over centuries before anyone thought to lay them out in straight lines. The houses were modest. Even the houses of the wealthy were built largely of timber and mud brick at this stage, though the roofs might be tiled now, the Etruscans having brought ceramic roof tiles to Rome along with everything else. The city was loud with the sounds of a large and active community, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the clatter of metal workers and potters at their trades, the voices of vendors, the prayers at public shrines, the periodic blast of the tubason's horn marking the hours and the ceremonies. The population of Rome at the end of the 6th century BCE is a matter of debate among historians. Estimates range from perhaps 20,000 to as many as 100,000, with most scholars clustering their estimates somewhere in the middle of that range. Whatever the precise number, it was a large city by the standards of the time and place, larger than most other communities in central Italy, large enough to be a significant military and economic power in the region. And it was diverse. This is something worth emphasizing because the image of Rome that comes down through later Roman self-presentation is often of a people defined by a specific character and a specific way of doing things. But from its earliest days, Rome was a place that absorbed outsiders. The Sabines came in with Titus Tatius. Alba Longa's population was relocated to Rome after its destruction under Tullus Hostilius. Etruscans came in with the Tarquin kings and their retinues. Merchants from the Greek colonies to the south passed through the Tiber port at Ostia, and some of them stayed. Refugees and adventurers and people without other options drifted in from the surrounding hills and stayed because the city offered, if nothing else, safety in numbers and the possibility of a fresh start. Rome had, from its beginnings, a tradition of incorporating outsiders that was quite unusual in the ancient world. Where many ancient cities maintained strict boundaries between citizens and foreigners, Rome developed, slowly, imperfectly, not without conflict, a more flexible understanding of who could become Roman. This flexibility would eventually become one of its most powerful tools of empire, the ability to extend citizenship, to make Romans out of the conquered, to enlarge the community rather than simply dominate and exploit it. But even in the earliest centuries, the pattern was there. The city on the 7 hills was a gathering place. It pulled people toward it, and the people it pulled in, it slowly made its own. Let us talk about the sacred landscape of early Rome, because to understand how these early Romans experienced their world, you need to understand that for them, the sacred was not separate from the everyday. The gods were not distant figures dwelling in some remote heaven while humans went about their business below. The gods were present. They inhabited specific places: a spring, a grove, a crossroads, the threshold of a door, the hearth at the center of a house. They required regular attention, regular feeding, regular acknowledgement. And neglecting them was not merely impious. It was dangerous. The Romans called this network of divine presences and divine requirements the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. As long as the proper rites were performed at the proper times by the proper people using the proper words, the gods would maintain their benevolent protection of the community. If the rites were neglected or performed incorrectly, or if some pollution entered the sacred sphere, the gods would withdraw their protection and misfortune would follow. Plague, military defeat, agricultural failure, strange prodigies in the sky. The Romans spent enormous effort, intellectual, financial, institutional, on maintaining the pax deorum. The city itself was organized in relation to the sacred. The pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city, roughly corresponding to the wall but in some cases differing from it, was the line across which no impurity could pass, no armed soldier could march, no corpse could be buried. The pomerium was not just a fortification. It was a religious perimeter. Inside it, the city was consecrated space. Outside it, the world was ordinary. Within the city, certain places were especially sacred. The Capitoline Hill, with its temple of Jupiter, was the center of Rome's relationship with its chief deity and with the divine forces that protected the state. The Forum Romanum below it was a space of both civic and sacred significance. The location of temples to Castor and Pollux, to Saturn, to Vesta, to the divine ancestors of the community. The Palatine Hill, with its associations with the founder Romulus, was especially charged with the weight of origins. The Temple of Vesta in the Forum was one of the most ancient and most important of Rome's sacred sites. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and her temple contained the sacred flame, the fire that had, in the Roman understanding, burned continuously since the earliest days of the community. This fire was the city's hearth, the symbol of Rome's continuity in life. It was tended by the Vestal Virgins, a college of 6 women who served Vesta for terms of 30 years, living in the house of the Vestals beside the temple, bound by strict rules of ritual purity, responsible for the fire's continuous burning and for the proper maintenance of Vesta's cult. If the flame went out, it was a terrible omen. The extinction of the sacred fire meant something had gone wrong with the city's relationship to the gods, and the Vestal responsible for allowing it to happen was punished severely. If a Vestal was found to have broken her vow of chastity, the penalty was death. She was buried alive in a small underground chamber with a few days' provisions, left to die without the city directly shedding her blood. This extreme punishment reflected the extreme importance of Vestal purity to the community's understanding of its own sacred integrity. In exchange for their service and their sacrifices, the Vestals occupied a position of remarkable privilege in Roman society. They could own property. They could travel in a litter-escorted carriage in the crowded streets, and people moved aside for them. They had seats of honor at public events. Their testimony in legal proceedings carried special weight. And when their 30 years of service were complete, they were free to marry, though few reportedly chose to, having spent their adult lives in a position of honor and independence that marriage would have substantially curtailed. The Vestal Virgins were, in a sense, the city's most important ritual specialists, the guardians of the continuity that linked the Rome of any given moment to the Rome of the founder and the Rome of the gods. Long after everything else about the city had changed, the kings replaced by consuls replaced by emperors, the mud brick replaced by marble, the small hilltop settlement replaced by a metropolis of 1 million people, the Vestals tended their fire in the Forum and the flame burned on. The gods of early Rome were numerous and specific and, in many cases, deeply local. The Romans did not merely worship Jupiter and Mars and Venus and the other great figures of later Roman mythology. They also honored a vast array of minor divine presences, the Lares who protected the household in the crossroads, the Penates who guarded the household's food supply, the genius of the paterfamilias who represented his generative power and his connection to the divine forces of life, the manes of the honored dead who were fed at their graves on certain days each year. Every door had its Janus, the two-faced god who looked simultaneously in and out and who presided over all beginnings. Every threshold had its liman, its guardianship. Every hearth had its Vesta. This populated world of divine presences made the Roman home and the Roman city simultaneously physical and sacred spaces. Every act of daily life, cooking a meal, crossing a threshold, planting a crop, going to war, was conducted in the presence of divine forces that needed to be acknowledged and respected. The prayers were not elaborate theological constructions. They were practical, specific, and formula-bound. I give to you that you may give to me. The Latin phrase "do ut" encapsulated the Roman understanding of the relationship between humans and gods. It was a relationship of reciprocity, of exchange, of mutual obligation. You maintained the gods maintained you. Break the formula and things went wrong. This practical, contractual understanding of religion sat somewhat oddly in later centuries, alongside the more personal and emotionally expressive religious traditions that Rome absorbed from Greece and the Near East. But in the early regal period, it was the dominant mode and it shaped everything. Roman religion was, at its core, a technology for managing relationships with the unseen forces that controlled the weather, the harvest, the outcome of battles, the health of families. It was not primarily concerned with personal salvation or spiritual transformation. It was concerned with results. And it worked, in the sense that a community that maintained its religious practices maintained its sense of collective identity and its confidence in the legitimacy of its own existence. The sacred fire burned. The vestals walked. The augurs read their birds. The priests made their offerings in the proper forms and with the proper words. And Rome, which had begun as a collection of mud huts on a set of unremarkable hills above a modest river, slowly, generation by generation, year by year, became something else. Let the fire burn low now. Let the night deepen. We have been sitting with early Rome for a long time, and the story has moved through many lives and many centuries, from the first settlers on the Palatine to the last of the Etruscan kings, from the mythological she-wolf to the very real, very practical question of what it meant to be Roman and what the gods required of a city that intended to endure. The republic that was born in 509 BC, born in outrage and expulsion, born from the story of a woman's honor and a city's shame, would go on to become something extraordinary. It would develop institutions of extraordinary ingenuity and resilience, ways of governing a growing community that balanced competing interests and distributed power with a sophistication that impressed and influenced political thinkers for the next 2,000 years. It would fight wars that took it beyond the Italian peninsula and eventually to the edges of the known world. It would absorb the cultures of everyone it conquered and be changed by them in return. It would build roads and aqueducts and libraries and baths and amphitheaters, and all of those things were, in some sense, already present in embryo in those dark circles in the soil of the Palatine, in those post holes from the huts of the 10th century BC. But we are not going there tonight. Tonight we are staying in the early city, the small city, the city that was still becoming itself. Because there is something in the smallness and the becoming that the later greatness can obscure if you are not careful. The marble city, the imperial city, the city of 1 million people and 40,000 miles of roads, that city is easier to describe because it left so much more behind it. But the city of the river and the hills and the sacred fire and the wolves in the dark was real too. It was perhaps more real in some ways because it was fragile and human and unsure of itself in the way that the great city of the emperors never had to be. The people who lived in those early centuries on the Palatine and the Capitoline and the Aventine, the people whose postholes are all that remain of their homes, they did not know they were building Rome. They did not know they were laying the foundations of an empire that would one day reach from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. They were simply living, farming their fields and tending their fires and worshiping their gods and telling their stories around their hearths in the evenings, as the Tiber ran dark below the hills and the stars came out one by one in the Italian sky. They could not have imagined what would come from what they were doing. No one can ever imagine that. The acorn cannot see the oak. The spring cannot see the sea. The small fire on the hilltop cannot see the flames it will eventually spread across the entire known world. They were just there, those first Romans, living as fully as they could in the world they had been given, doing what humans do, finding food, making shelter, falling in love, having children, burying their dead, trying to understand the forces that moved the world around them, trying to make some kind of peace with the darkness and the cold and the mystery of existence. And from that trying, from that most human of activities, from all those small daily choices made by people whose names are lost and whose faces we will never see, something grew. Something patient and accumulative and astonishing grew beside that ancient river. Something that would in time change the world so completely that we are still 2,500 years later, living inside the changes it made. The river is still moving in the darkness below the hills. The water is the same water. The same Tiber, making the same journey from the Apennines to the sea that it has always made, that it was making before the first hut was built on the Palatine, that it will go on making long after the last trace of what Rome built has been absorbed back into the earth. But the hills above the river remember. The soil holds its shadows. The dark circles in the orange earth are still there, under the marble and the concrete and the basilicas and the palaces and the thousands of years of layers that cover the post holes of those first small huts. Dig deep enough and you find them. The beginning of everything. It is a good thing to remember when the world seems very large and very complex and very far from any recognizable starting point, that all great things began very small. That Rome began with a river and a fig tree and 2 infants in a basket. That the Senate began as a gathering of old men sitting around a fire on a hilltop. That the legions that would conquer the known world descended from shepherds with wooden spears, guarding their cattle on the banks of a modest Italian river. Everything begins small. Everything begins with someone simply trying to live, simply trying to understand, simply trying to build something in a particular place on a particular day because the light was good there, or the soil was rich, or the river ran close enough to be useful and far enough below the hills to be safe when the winter floods came. That is the Rome we have been visiting tonight. Not the Rome of the Colosseum and the Forum and the marble emperors. The Rome of the mud huts and the sacred fire and the Tiber reflecting the moon on a clear October evening. The Rome that was still, in those first centuries, just a possibility. A gathering of people on a set of unremarkable hills, tending their fires, telling their stories, reaching toward each other across the marshy valley, building something they could not yet name. Let us close our eyes now and sit for a moment in that world. Feel the coolness of the evening coming off the Tiber. The air smells of river mud and wild rosemary and the ghost of a day's heat still rising from the stones. Above you, the stars are extraordinary. More stars than you have ever seen, the Milky Way, a great river of light stretching from horizon to horizon, a river above the river, 2 silver paths running in the same direction toward the same dark sea. The fire is warm. It burns with the particular steadiness of a fire that has been well built and well tended, not too large, not too small, just right for the evening, just right for sitting beside without effort. The wood is oak from the hillside, and it burns clean and slow and with a warmth that reaches all the way through you, the way warmth does when you have been moving all day and have finally been still long enough to let it in. Someone is speaking. A voice, low and steady, telling a story about how the hills were formed, about why the river runs the way it runs, about the time a wolf nursed 2 children by the water's edge and everything changed. You don't need to follow every word. The voice is enough. The rhythm of it, the warm dark underneath the words, the fire, the stars, the river. You are very comfortable. You are very still. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. You are exactly where you should be in this moment, in this particular quiet. The Tiber moves on below the hills, patient as it has always been, carrying its slow load of mountain water toward the sea, past the reeds and the willow trees and the flat bars of pale gravel where the herons stand in the first light of morning, still as sculptures, waiting. The sacred fire burns in its temple in the valley below. It has always burned. It will always burn. The Vestal circles it in the morning dark, her white robes catching the light, her movements the practiced calm of someone who has done this 10,000 times and found that each time is still the first time. On the Palatine Hill, someone is sleeping. They are curled on their side, a woolen blanket pulled up to their chin, the warmth of the embers in the hearth making the air inside the small round hut just warm enough. Outside, the wind is moving through the oak trees, and the sound of it is the sound of something old and patient and entirely unbothered by human concerns. The river makes its quiet sound somewhere below. An owl calls once somewhere on the Capitoline. Then silence. And in that silence, Rome sleeps. It will wake in the morning. It will go on doing what it always does, growing, building, arguing, praying, farming, fighting, learning, losing, beginning again. It will become, in time, the most powerful civilization the Western world has ever known. It will build things that last. It will write things that endure. It will create laws and roads and ideas and ways of being human that are still, in ways large and small and mostly invisible, part of the world we inhabit tonight. But that is tomorrow. That is the long future. Tonight, Rome is small and new and sleeping. And you can sleep too. Let the story settle over you the way the warmth of a fire settles, gently and completely, reaching every part of you until there is no cold left anywhere. Let the sound of the Tiber move through your thoughts, not disturbing them, not directing them, just moving through them the way water moves through reeds, bending them gently and passing on. The hills are quiet. The stars have reached their highest point. The fire has burned down to a steady glow of orange coals that will last until morning without needing any more wood, because someone built it right, built it for the long night, built it to last. You are warm. You are safe. You are exactly where you should be. The ancient city rests beneath its layers of stone in time. The river moves in the dark. And everything that was built and everything that grew from those small beginnings on those unremarkable hills, all of it has come to this. A moment of quiet so complete that even the oldest stories grow still. Rome is sleeping. And so, very gently, very slowly, are you. The river carries the moonlight toward the sea. The wind moves through the oak trees on the Palatine. Somewhere in the soft dark of a Roman night, in a year that no longer matters, in a city that is still becoming itself, the sacred fire burns steadily on. And the stars look down on the hills, and the hills look down on the river, and the river moves on through the dark, patient and ancient and altogether at peace, as it has always been, as it will always be, as long as there are hills and stars in the deep and quiet dark of a night that has no end. Rest now. Let the story carry you. The Tiber is moving. The stars are out. Rome is sleeping. And the world is, for this soft and gentle moment, entirely still. There is a time of year in central Italy, in the weeks just after the summer has ended and the autumn has not yet fully arrived, when the light does something extraordinary. It turns gold. Not the pale gold of morning or the orange gold of sunset, but a deep, warm, heavy gold that seems to come not just from the sun but from the land itself, from the dry hillsides and the bleached grass and the dust on the roads and the first turning leaves of the oak trees. Everything is saturated with it. The shadows go blue. The white limestone outcrops on the hillsides glow like lanterns. The Tiber, catching this light on its surface in the late afternoon, becomes a ribbon of hammered bronze moving slow and purposeful through the golden plain. The early Romans would have known this light intimately. They would have organized their agricultural calendar around it, recognized it as the signal that the harvest time was drawing to a close, that the grapes had been gathered and the wine was working in its jars, that the olives were beginning to turn and would need to be picked before the first hard frost. They would have known it the way farmers always know the particular qualities of the particular light of the place where they live, not as a piece of knowledge that can be stated but as something felt in the body, a cue that activates old habits and old preparations. The agricultural year was the original Roman year, and its rhythms ran underneath everything else that the city would eventually become. The consuls and the Senate and the legions and the law courts were superstructures built on top of a foundation that was always, at its base, about grain and grapes and olives and cattle and the particular anxiety of a community that depends on the annual harvest for its survival. The month of April, which the Romans associated with the founding of the city, was in the agricultural calendar the time of first plowing and first sowing, the time of new beginnings, the time when the earth was ready to receive what would grow in it. It was appropriate, whether or not it was literally true, that Rome was born in April, because April was when the year itself was born, when the potential of the coming season was at its most complete and most unrealized. The month of October was the time of the final harvest, the bringing in of the last of the grain, the pressing of the last grapes, the sealing of the storage jars with their year's supply of oil and dried fruit and cured meats. It was also the time of certain military rituals. The October horse, a sacrifice to Mars of the near horse of the winning chariot in a race on the field of Mars, a ritual so ancient that even the Romans of the historical period did not entirely understand its original meaning. It was enough that it was old. It was enough that it had always been done. Every month had its obligations, its sacrifices, its prohibited days and its favorable ones. The Roman religious calendar was a document of extraordinary complexity, built up over centuries from layers of different traditions. Some Latin, some Sabine, some Etruscan, some very ancient indeed, older than any of these specific cultural identities, preserved in ritual form long after the meaning behind the form had faded into the general haze of the very old. The Lupercalia in February, for example. This festival, held on the 15th, involved young men called Luperci running naked through the streets of Rome, striking everyone they encountered with strips of goat hide. Striking with the goat skin was believed to promote fertility in women and purification of the community as a whole. The festival was so ancient and so embedded in Roman custom that it survived well into the Christian era, celebrated by the Romans of the 5th century CE long after most of them had officially converted. The Bishop of Rome at the time wrote a letter condemning it with considerable force, which is how we know it was still being practiced. Nobody knew quite where the Lupercalia came from. It seemed to be connected to Lupercus, a god of shepherds, perhaps related to Faunus, the Roman equivalent of Pan, the wild goat man of the pastoral world. It may have been connected, in some older layer of tradition, to the wolf in the founding story, to the cave on the Palatine where the she-wolf was said to have nursed Romulus and Remus. The Romans were not troubled by the uncertainty. The ritual was ancient. That was enough. You did not need to understand why you did something to know that you needed to keep doing it. The Parentalia in February was the feast of the ancestors. For 9 days, from the 13th to the 21st, the Romans remembered their dead. The temples were closed. Weddings were forbidden. Magistrates did not wear their insignia of office. The city entered a kind of suspended state, a time set apart from ordinary business for the acknowledgement of the dead who were always, in the Roman understanding, present, not gone, not distant, but simply in another relationship with the living, requiring regular acknowledgement and feeding to remain benevolent rather than hungry and resentful. Families visited the tombs of their ancestors and left offerings: violets, wine, bread, and salt. They poured libations into the earth above the graves. They spoke the names of the dead. The speaking of names was important. A person who was remembered, whose name was spoken over their grave, was not entirely gone. A person whose name was forgotten, whose grave was untended, was something worse than dead. They were lost, wandering, cut off from the web of relationship and memory that gave existence its meaning. The Romans were, in this sense, a people who refused to let things end. The ancestors remained present in their households and in their festivals and in the legal structures of the family. The founding stories, no matter how mythological, remained living parts of civic identity. The sacred sites and the sacred fires and the sacred words of prayer so ancient that their meaning was disputed, all of these were maintained, tended, kept alive, because to let them go was to break the thread of continuity that connected the present to the past and through the past to the divine sources of legitimacy and protection. This refusal to let things end would eventually make the Romans very good at empire. An empire requires, among other things, the confidence that what you are building is worth preserving, that the effort of maintaining it across vast distances and many generations is worthwhile, that continuity itself is of value. The Romans had that confidence in their bones. Let us walk through the city for a moment. Let us take a slow walk through the Rome of the early Republic in the 5th century BC and try to see what it looked like, smelled like, felt like to be there. You begin on the Palatine Hill in the early morning. The air is cool. There is a mist on the Tiber below, and through it the opposite bank is just visible, the flat land where the cattle graze and the farmers are already moving in the fields, their figures indistinct in the haze. Behind you, on the slope of the hill, the houses are waking up. You can hear the sound of shutters being opened, of a door banging shut, of a child crying briefly and then being soothed. A cock is crowing somewhere further up the hill, and from a distance there is the hollow knock of a woodpecker in one of the oak trees. You walk down the slope of the Palatine on a path that is wide enough for 2 people to pass, but only just, the surface packed hard by generations of feet. On either side, the houses are modest. Timber frames, mud brick walls, tiled roofs now, the Etruscan innovation of fired clay tiles having replaced the old thatch a generation or 2 ago. The larger houses have small walled gardens at the back where a fig tree grows and a few rows of cabbages and onions and herbs. The smaller houses open directly onto the path. You pass a shrine at the intersection of 2 paths, a square stone with a small carved face, perhaps a lar, one of the guardian spirits of the crossroads. with a small bunch of dried flowers recently placed beside it and the dark stain of a wine libation poured on the stone. Someone passes you on the path, a man carrying a large clay jar on his shoulder, moving quickly toward the market on the lower slopes. He glances at you and nods. You nod back. The path descends toward the Forum Valley, and as you walk down, you can feel the air changing, growing cooler and slightly damper, the mist still lying in the low ground between the hills. The Forum itself is just becoming visible ahead of you, the open paved space not very large by any standard, surrounded on its edges by temples and the older sacred sites and the stalls of vendors just setting up for the day's business. The smell of the Forum in the morning is a complex thing. There is the smell of the earth itself, the dark, rich smell of the drained marsh that is always faintly underneath everything. There is the smell of food, bread baking somewhere, garlic and olive oil, the sharp green smell of fresh herbs from a vendor's basket. There is the smell of the sacred, smoke from the altars, the particular dry scent of incense offered at the shrines. And underneath all of it, the smell of the city itself, of thousands of people living in close proximity, the organic communal smell that every city that has ever existed has had and that no city has ever entirely escaped. The vendors are setting up. A woman with a basket of dried figs is arranging them in neat rows on a cloth spread on the ground. A man with a cart of salt fish, small dried anchovies, their smell sharp and salt and sea, is calling out to the people passing by. A potter has arranged his wares in a half-circle, red clay bowls and storage jars and drinking cups, their surface is smooth and slightly shiny in the morning light. At the far end of the Forum, on the low rise that leads to the Capitoline Hill, you can see the great temple of Jupiter taking shape. It is still under construction in these years of the early 5th century BCE, its walls rising above the surrounding buildings, its scaffolding of lashed timber poles the most dramatic feature of the city's skyline. Workers are already moving along the scaffolding, their figures small against the height of the walls. The sound of hammers on stone carries across the Forum. Beside the Temple of Vesta, in its round sanctuary, the morning fire is already burning. It burns with the particular steadiness of a fire that has been properly tended through the night, fed at the proper intervals, kept at the proper size. Not too large, not too small, just the right steady flame for the right sacred purpose. A Vestal Virgin in her white robes stands before the shrine, her head covered, her lips moving in the words of the morning prayer. She does not look at the people passing. She is in conversation with the goddess, and that conversation takes precedence over everything else in the world. The morning prayer. Think for a moment about what that means in the life of a city. Every morning, before the business of the day begins, before the courts open and the Senate convenes and the merchants begin their transactions and the farmers go to their fields, every morning, without exception, the sacred fire is tended and the proper words are spoken and the relationship between Rome and its divine protectors is renewed and reaffirmed. The prayer is not elaborate. It is formulaic, the same words in the same order that they have always been. And that repetition is not a failure of imagination. It is the whole point. The constancy is the prayer. You are standing in the Forum now, in the early morning, and the city is waking up around you, and everything is very much as it will be for centuries. Not the same buildings. The buildings will be torn down and rebuilt and enlarged and replaced over and over. Not the same people. The people will change with every generation, their faces and their names and their specific worries and joys all different. But the morning fire and the morning prayer and the morning business of the Forum, the sounds and smells of a city going about the daily work of being itself, these will remain recognizably for a very long time. There is something comforting in that continuity. Not the false comfort of nothing ever changing, which is not comfort at all but a kind of death. The true comfort of recognizing that beneath all the changes, beneath the centuries of rebuilding and reform and revolution, something persists. Something in the essential human act of making a place and calling it home, of tending a fire and saying the morning prayer and going out to meet the day. The Senate would have met in this period in the Curia, a building whose exact form in the early Republic we cannot fully reconstruct, though it was probably a large rectangular hall near the Forum, and its location between the Comitium, the old assembly space, and the Forum itself was significant, marking it as the place where the city's most serious deliberations took place. The senators came from the oldest and most distinguished families, and their coming together in that hall was itself a kind of ceremony, a reenactment each time of the original act of gathering, the founding decision to make decisions together rather than alone. They wore their togas, the toga of the patrician senators edged with a broad stripe of purple, the toga of the equestrians with a narrower stripe. The toga itself was a remarkable garment, not comfortable or practical in any ordinary sense, its yards of heavy woolen fabric requiring a specific way of draping and holding and moving that expressed, through its very awkwardness, the dignity of the person wearing it. You could not rush in a toga. You could not fight in a toga. You could not do manual work in a toga. The toga was the garment of deliberation, of judgment, of the kind of considered, careful public life that the Roman aristocrat was supposed to embody. The senators debated. They argued. They had, in the early republic, a tremendous variety of individual characters and individual agendas, and the debates were not always orderly. But they were governed by rules, who could speak in what order for how long, and the rules themselves were a form of respect for the institution, a recognition that the collective process of deliberation was more important than any individual outcome. When the Senate voted, it did so in a specific way. The presiding magistrate proposed a resolution, and the senators physically moved to one side of the hall or the other to indicate their position. Their votes were visible, literal, embodied. You could see with your own eyes where each man stood. There was no hiding behind the anonymity of a secret ballot in the early Roman Senate. Your position was your public position carried in your body through the hall. This physical visibility extended to the popular assemblies as well. The Roman citizen who came to vote in the comitia, the various forms of popular assembly, did not mark a paper or pull a lever. He walked. He walked through a physical space organized to record his vote through his movement through it, voting in his century or his tribe depending on the type of assembly, the collective choices of the community expressed through the organized movement of thousands of bodies in a physical space. These voting spaces, the comitium, later the ovile or sheepfold as it was sometimes called, were themselves sacred spaces consecrated for the purpose. To vote in the comitium was to participate in a sacred act, the collective self-determination of a community that understood its self-governance as itself a form of religious practice, an expression of the community's relationship to the divine order that had established it. The citizen who walked through that space to cast his vote was doing something that his great-great-grandfather had done, and that his great-great-grandson would do in the same space, through the same forms for generations. He was part of something larger than himself, something that had existed before him and would continue after him, something that carried the weight of the ancestors in its forms and gestures. He was, in that moment, Rome, not a subject of Rome, not an inhabitant of Rome. Rome itself, acting, choosing, moving through the sacred space where choices were made. This sense of being Rome, of being constitutive of the city rather than merely resident in it, was one of the most powerful things about the early republic, and one of the things that distinguished it most sharply from the monarchies that surrounded it. The king of an ancient city was a sovereign, and his subjects were exactly that, subject to his will. The Roman citizen of the republic was something harder to define. He was not sovereign in his own right, but he was not entirely subject either. He was a member of a collective that held sovereignty, and his membership conferred on him a dignity and a set of rights and a connection to the communal enterprise that no private citizen of any other ancient city quite had in the same way. That dignity was real, even for the poorest Roman citizen, even for the man who owned no land and served in the lowest class of the army and had almost no practical political voice. He was still a Roman citizen. And a Roman citizen, even of the humblest station, had a name, a legal identity, rights under the law, the protection of the tribunes, and the right to stand in the forum and hear the morning prayer and know that the sacred fire burning in Vesta's temple was burning for him too, as much as for the consul and the senator and the great men of the great families. The dignity of the Roman citizen was, like so many of the most important things in the Roman system, more aspiration than reality for most of the people it theoretically described. The poor were poor, and poverty in the ancient world was grinding and dangerous and left almost no margin for the kind of dignified civic engagement that the Roman ideal described. The client who depended on his patron's gifts to eat was not, in any meaningful practical sense, the equal of the patron. The freedman who owed his former master a series of ongoing obligations was not fully free in the way the language of freedom implied. But the aspiration was there. The language was there. The legal framework was there, however imperfectly it functioned. And the aspiration, the language, and the legal framework created a kind of pressure, a constant, chronic pressure toward the fuller realization of what the system claimed to be. It was under that pressure that the plebeians won their long struggle. It was under that pressure that the Republic developed, over centuries, into something more genuinely inclusive than it had been at the beginning. The aspiration was the engine. The gap between ideal and reality was not a failure of the system but the source of the energy that drove it forward. In the evenings, the city settled. The forum emptied as the light changed from gold to amber and the shadows of the Capitoline grew long across the paved ground. The vendors gathered their unsold goods. The last of the day's legal proceedings were concluded. The augurs made their evening observations and recorded the signs they had seen, adding them to the long cumulative record of the celestial and avian communications from the divine world that the Roman priestly colleges had been building up for generations. In the households on the surrounding hills, the evening meal was being prepared. The fire in the kitchen was at its highest point of the day, and the smell of cooking grain and herbs and whatever else the household's resources and the season's availability had provided drifted out through the open doorways and across the streets. Children were called in from wherever they had been playing. The paterfamilias returned from the forum. The family gathered at the low table in the atrium, and the meal was conducted with the small religious observances that marked every significant family activity. A prayer, a libation to the Lares, the acknowledgement that this food and this gathering were not merely practical events but part of the larger sacred order that organized life. After the meal, in the long summer evenings, the household might sit outside for a while, on the bench beside the door or in the small courtyard at the back. In the winter, they gathered around the hearth. And in either case, someone told a story. Stories were how the community preserved its memory, before and even during the period when writing existed but was used mainly for official purposes. The stories of the founding, the stories of the kings, the stories of the great families and their famous ancestors, the stories of unusual natural events that had been seen as omens and what those omens had predicted, all of these circulated through the households of Rome, told and retold, polished and embellished and occasionally improved, carrying the community's sense of itself across the generations. The Romans had a name for this tradition of oral historical narrative. The Carmina Convivialia, the songs of the banquets, the stories told at dinner tables and around hearths that preserved the memory of the great men of the past and their great deeds. The earliest Roman historians, writing in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, could draw on this tradition even as they were also learning from Greek historical writing to organize it into something more systematic. The oral tradition was the substrate of the written one. So the stories moved from mouth to ear, from firelight to firelight, from generation to generation. The story of Romulus and the furrow. The story of Numa and the nymph in the grove. The story of the she-wolf and the basket in the river. The story of Lucretia and Brutus and the expulsion of the kings. All of these stories were being told in Roman households long before anyone wrote them down, and the telling of them was itself a sacred act. An act of communal memory, a renewal of identity, a way of saying, this is who we are, this is where we came from, this is what we believe about ourselves and our place in the world. Outside, the Tiber was running in the dark. It ran through all those evenings, through all those stories, through all those generations of people sitting around their fires telling each other who they were. It ran past the smoke-blackened posts of the earliest huts and past the tiled roofs of the later houses and past the scaffolding of the great temples going up on the Capitoline and past the newly paved surface of the Forum and past all of it, indifferent and patient and entirely absorbed in the one thing it had to do. Run. Simply run. The river runs and the stories are told and the fire burns and the city grows and the years pass one by one in their orderly way, each one a circle completed. The agricultural year from April's plowing to February's parendalia, the cycle of seasons from the gold of autumn harvest to the bare cold clarity of the winter hills to the tentative green of the first spring shoots pushing up through the brown earth to the full burning summer heat and back again to the gold, and the circles of the years accumulate into the circles of the generations, and the generations accumulate into history, and history accumulates into the thing we are trying to understand tonight, the thing we have been circling all evening, the thing that the river has been running past all along. The thing is this: a human community in a specific place, in a specific time, managed to build something that lasted. It built institutions and laws and roads and ways of thinking about justice and governance and the proper relationship between the individual and the collective that have persisted, in various forms and through many transformations, down to the present day. It made mistakes. Enormous, catastrophic, morally terrible mistakes, as all human communities do and as Rome did with a thoroughness proportional to its power. It was unjust in ways that can still be enumerated at length. It was violent in ways that should still appall. It was unequal in ways that its own ideals condemned even as its practice perpetuated them. And it made something. It built something that deserves to be understood, not worshipped or imitated uncritically or held up as a model to be followed, but understood. Understood the way you understand a river, by following it from its source, by attending to its bends and its shallows and its floods, by watching the light it catches at different hours of the day and in different seasons, by knowing its name and its origins and the sea it is always moving toward. The Tiber's source is in the Apennine Mountains, in a beech forest near the small modern city of Pieve Santo Stefano, in the region of Tuscany. It rises from a spring the way rivers rise, quietly and without announcement. It begins as a trickle between rocks in the shadow of the trees. It grows as other trickles join it, as the slope steepens and the water picks up speed and direction and begins to understand itself as a river rather than a series of separate trickles. And it runs south and west, gathering its tributaries, growing brownish and serious, passing through cities that were old when Rome was young and are old still, under bridges of Roman stone and medieval stone and modern concrete, past the same hills it has always passed, changing in its details and unchanging in its direction, until it reaches the city. And through the city it flows, past the Palatine and the Capitoline and the Aventine, past the bend where the boats used to dock and sometimes still do, past the Isola Tiberina, the island in the middle of the river, connected to both banks by bridges, home to a temple of Aesculapius the healer god, a place of pilgrimage for the sick since before the historical period, past the Campus Martius where the legions drilled and the people voted in the great popular assemblies, past all of it, unhurried and brown and thoroughly itself, and then out, through the marshes at the river's mouth, through the estuary that the Romans tried repeatedly to keep clear of the silt the river constantly deposited, and into the sea, into the vast and changeable Mediterranean, the Middle Sea, the sea around which the whole story of Rome spread itself across 1,000 years. The river runs to the sea receives it, and somewhere in the chemistry of that meeting, the specific water of the Tiber, the mountain water and the city water and all the ordinary water of all the ordinary days that the river has carried, becomes indistinguishable from the rest of it, from all the water that has ever run into this sea, from every river and every land that touches it. That is what happens to stories too. The specific stories of the specific people of early Rome, the shepherd Faustulus and his foster sons, the Vestal Rhea Silvia, the senator who walked his field in the first spring morning, the woman weaving in the lamplight, the augur watching his birds in the pale dawn sky. All of those specific stories eventually flow into the larger water of what we call history. And in that larger water they become part of something that is no longer quite Roman and no longer quite ancient, but simply human, part of the common inheritance of everyone who has ever tried to understand where they came from and why it matters. We are all in some sense downstream from Rome. Not only those of us who live in places that were once Roman provinces, or who speak languages descended from Latin, or who live under legal systems built on Roman foundations. All of us, because the questions Rome asked about how communities should be organized, how power should be distributed, what obligation the individual owes to the collective and the collective owes to the individual, those questions are everyone's questions now. They don't have Roman answers anymore, but they are still recognizably shaped by the way Rome first formulated them, the specific words and concepts and institutional forms through which Rome tried, imperfectly and sometimes brilliantly, to address them. We are downstream, and the river is still running. Let it run then. Let it run through the night. past the sleeping city and the darkened forum and the temples with their closed doors and the sacred fire that never closes, through all the history that presses up against its banks, through all the stories and all the years and all the mornings and evenings that Rome has ever known. Let it run, dark and patient and indifferent to its own importance, doing the one thing rivers do, running from the mountain to the sea. And let the night deepen around it. The stars are high now. They have moved across the sky since we began. You can see it if you look, the slow wheel of the heavens turning as it always turns, as it turned above the huts of the first settlers and above the temples of the Etruscan kings and above the smoke of the Gallic fires and above the legions marching south and above every ordinary night in the lives of ordinary Romans going about the business of living and sleeping and waking up again. The sky turns, the river runs, the fire burns, and the city that is Rome, the city that has been here for a very long time and will be here in some form for a very long time more, lies still in the soft dark breathing. Consider what it must have felt like to be the first generation. Not the mythological generation of Romulus and Remus, but the real first generation. The people who were there when the community of the Palatine Hill was just beginning to reach beyond itself, just beginning to pull other communities into its orbit, just beginning to understand itself as something that might grow into something larger. The ordinary people. The ones whose names we will never know. Consider the farmer on the Palatine whose great-great-grandfather had built the original hut on the hillside, and who now owned a small stone-walled house with a tiled roof and a garden with a fig tree and 2 rooms for sleeping and a storage pit lined with clay where the grain was kept against the winter. He is in his 40s, which in the world of the early republic is already old. The average life expectancy was not what we experience today, and the man who reached his 40s had already outlived a significant portion of the people he had grown up with. He has buried 2 of his children. He has watched his wife's hair go from dark to silver in the youth. Every corner where the soil is deepest and richest and the grain grows most thickly. He has also served in the army. Every Roman male citizen was liable for military service, and our farmer has answered the summons more than once, marching out with his neighbors under the command of the consul to fight the equi in the hills or to settle a border dispute with a neighboring community. He has seen men die beside him. He has felt the weight of his shield and his javelin on a hot summer day when the march had been going since before dawn and the objective was still an uncertain distance ahead. He has slept on the ground under the stars with his sandals tucked under his head because they were the softest thing he had and the earth was hard. He has come home again each time to the farm and the fig tree and the wife and the children and the particular light of an October afternoon on the hills above the Tiber. He does not think of himself as building Rome. He thinks of himself as doing what needs to be done, plowing the fields, paying the obligations to his patron, fulfilling his military service when called, attending the assemblies in the forum, though he rarely speaks and is not sure his vote makes much practical difference, maintaining the household rites, the morning prayer at the large shrine, the evening libation, the proper observances on the festival days, teaching his surviving son what the son will need to know to do the same things year after year, in the same fields, in the same house, in the same city. He is, in his own understanding, simply a Roman. And being a Roman means doing all of these things, in this order, in this way, because this is what Romans do and what their fathers did and what their fathers' fathers did back to the beginning. He does not know he is being watched by history. He does not know that the life he is living, so modest and so particular, is itself one of the cells in the body of something immense. He knows only the light on the hillside and the sound of the river at night and the feel of the earth under his feet when he walks the boundary of his fields on a March morning to check how the young grain is coming. And the earth remembers. That is the thought that settles, in the quiet of this late hour, over everything. The earth remembers. The same earth under the same sky above the same river, holding in its layers the evidence of everything that has happened on and to it, the hut posts and the fire pits and the graves and the plow lines and the footprints of sandaled feet on every road that ever ran between the hills and the forum. All of it is there, under the modern city, under the centuries, held in the patient dark of the soil. You cannot see it from the surface. From the surface, Rome looks like marble and ruins and traffic and tourists and the complicated overlay of 2,000 years of subsequent history on top of the original thing. But dig down. Dig carefully with small tools and a great deal of patience, the way the archaeologists dig. And you find it, the dark circles, the fire stains, the layers of the city building itself, stratum by stratum, century by century, the old being covered by the new being covered by the new again, the whole accumulated weight of Rome's long life pressed into the earth like a book, readable by those who know the language. The language is material. The language is clay and bone and carbon and the chemistry of soil disturbed and resettled, again and again, by the lives that moved through it. The archaeologists read this language the way readers read the language of words. Carefully, slowly, with the constant awareness that a single careless movement can destroy something irreplaceable. Something that has been waiting in the dark for 3,000 years to be understood. This is the patience that history requires. The same patience the river has. The same patience the earth has. The same patience that the long story of Rome asks of anyone who wants to understand it fully. Not the headlines and the monuments and the famous names, but the whole thing, the complete thing, the ordinary farmer in his field and the vestal at her fire and the child learning the household prayers and the senator walking through the forum in the early morning with his toga catching the first light of the day. The whole thing. It is very late now. The stars have moved. The Tiber's sound is softer at this hour, as if the river too has found its way to a quieter reach of its journey. The city on the hills is at its deepest stillness. There is no sound of hammers or wagon wheels or voices raised in argument. The forum is empty and silvered with faint moonlight, the paving stones cold and still, the temples dark behind their columns, the sacred flame a single point of warm orange in the larger silver dark. The river carries that orange point very faintly on its surface. A reflection of a reflection of a reflection. The flame in the temple and its reflection in the eyes of the vestal and her image in the water of the impluvium, and somewhere, impossibly far away, a hint of that warmth reaching the dark surface of the Tiber and dissolving into it, becoming part of the river's journey, carried south and west toward the sea. Everything moves eventually toward the sea. And you are moving now, gently, without effort, toward the deep rest that is the sea of every day. The place the body knows how to reach without being told. The place that is always there, waiting at the end of the day's long journey. The place where the day releases its hold and something older and quieter takes over. The slow rhythm of breathing in the dark, the warmth of covers, the particular silence of a room where someone is truly, deeply at rest. The river runs. The flame burns. The hills are still. Rome sleeps. And you who have traveled tonight from the first post holes in the Palatine soil to the last night of the kings, who have walked the forum in the morning mist and heard the Senate in its hall and followed the Tiber from its mountain source to the sea, you have earned your rest too. Let it come. Let it take you, as the river takes everything gently and without hurry, into its own particular kind of peace. The world is old and full of stories. All the good ones begin beside a river. Rest. The Republic arrived not with a banner or a proclamation or a clear moment that anyone who was living through it could have identified as the pivot point of history. It arrived the way most great changes arrive. Gradually, then all at once, and then as if it had always been this way. What the Romans abolished in 509 BC was not merely a king. They abolished the idea of a king. And that distinction would shape everything that followed. The Latin word for king was rex. By the time of the Republic, that word had become, in the Roman political vocabulary, one of the most dangerous things you could call a man. To accuse a Roman of wanting to be rex, of seeking kingly power, of accumulating too much authority, of behaving as if the state existed for his benefit rather than the other way around, was to accuse him of the worst kind of political crime. Julius Caesar, more than 400 years after the last king was driven out, was murdered in part because people believed he wanted to be called rex. And that belief was enough to make his killers feel they were acting in the oldest and most honorable Roman tradition. The fear of the rex was that deep, that persistent, that structurally built into the Roman political imagination. It never entirely went away. In place of the king, the Romans created two magistrates. Consuls they came to be called, though the earliest title may have been different. Two men elected annually from the patrician class, each holding equal authority, each able to veto the actions of the other. They commanded the army in war. They presided over the Senate and the popular assemblies. They administered justice. For 1 year, they were the most powerful figures in the state. And then their year ended, and they became private citizens again, accountable to the law like everyone else. The brilliance of this system, and it was brilliant whatever its many flaws, was the distribution of power across time and across persons. No single man could accumulate the kind of authority that Tarquinius Superbus had wielded, because the system was specifically designed to prevent that accumulation. Power was annual, collegial, divided, and surrounded on all sides by the authority of the Senate and the legal rights of the Roman people. It was a system that made tyranny very difficult. It also made decisiveness very difficult. 2 consuls with equal authority and the right to veto each other could, and sometimes did, paralyze the government entirely when they disagreed. The Romans had a solution for emergencies: the dictator. In a genuine crisis, a terrible military situation, an internal catastrophe, the Senate could authorize the appointment of a single magistrate with supreme authority, a dictator, but one who could serve for no more than 6 months and who was expected to resign the moment the emergency was passed. The most celebrated early dictator, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, was plowing his field when the messengers from Rome found him to offer him the office in 458 BCE. He accepted, handled the military crisis in 15 days, resigned the dictatorship, and went back to his plow. The Romans loved this story, told it for centuries, pointed to Cincinnatus as the model of what Roman virtue looked like when it was most purely itself. Not the glory of power, not the accumulation of wealth, but the willingness to serve when called and to stop serving when the need had passed. The earliest republic was not a democracy, and we should be clear about that. The consuls were patricians. The Senate was composed predominantly of patricians. The senior priesthoods were reserved for patricians. The patrician families, there were perhaps 30 to 50 of them in the early republic, ancient clans whose names appear again and again in the historical record, dominated every significant institution of the Roman state. They occupied the highest offices, commanded the largest armies, owned the most land, and controlled the religious apparatus that defined what was sacred and what was not. The plebeians, the non-patrician majority of the Roman citizen body, had the right to vote in the assemblies and to serve in the army, which they did in great numbers. But they could not hold the consulship, could not sit in the Senate, could not take the augury or the flaminate, could not marry a patrician. The distinctions were legal and hereditary and, in the earliest centuries, essentially absolute. What followed was one of the most fascinating political struggles in the ancient world. A conflict so long and so complex and so revealing of the way human societies actually negotiate power and identity that historians have been studying it with the closest attention for 2,000 years. It is called the conflict of the orders, and it ran from roughly the beginning of the Republic in 509 BCE to the Lex Hortensia of 287 BC, more than 2 centuries of legal and political struggle between the patrician elite and the plebeian majority, during which the plebeians slowly, gradually, with patience and with occasional moments of startling boldness, dismantled the exclusive privileges of the patrician class and secured for themselves legal equality and eventually social acceptance. The weapons the plebeians used in this struggle were not primarily military, though that option existed and was occasionally implied. Their most powerful weapon was the secession, the collective withdrawal of the plebeian population from the city, a form of civic strike that the ancient world had never seen deployed quite so effectively. If the patricians needed the plebeians to build the roads, to man the walls, to fight the wars, to pay the taxes that kept the city functioning, then the plebeians had leverage that they could exercise if they were willing to be collectively organized and collectively determined. The first secession, according to the tradition, took place around 494 BCE, when the plebeian population, fed up with debt bondage and political exclusion, withdrew from the city and camped on the sacred mount outside Rome's boundaries. The patricians, suddenly confronted with the prospect of a city without its working majority, negotiated. The result was the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, magistrates elected by the plebeian assembly, with the specific function of protecting individual plebeians from arbitrary patrician authority. The tribune's power was called sacrosanctitas, inviolability, meaning that anyone who physically interfered with a tribune in the exercise of their duties could be killed on the spot, and the killer would bear no legal guilt for the death. The tribune was, by religious sanction, untouchable. The tribunate became, over the following centuries, one of the most important institutions in the Roman state, and eventually one of the most abused. In the early Republic, the tribunes were limited in their power but used it with sometimes extraordinary effect, throwing themselves physically between a patrician official and a plebeian citizen, interposing their sacred bodies as living legal protection. They could veto. The word veto is Latin, meaning I forbid, and it was the tribune's word, the tribune's power, any action by any magistrate that they deemed harmful to the plebeian interest. The 12 Tables were another product of plebeian pressure. Written down around 450 BCE, they were the first attempt to codify Roman law in a publicly accessible form, to take the unwritten customary law that the patrician legal experts had been administering in ways that conveniently served patrician interests and make it visible, legible, permanent. You could not change what you could read. The 12 Tables were simple and sometimes brutal. They included provisions for debt enforcement that modern eyes find shocking, but they were public, and their publicity was itself a form of protection. The law was no longer something that only the initiated could know and interpret. It was there, written in bronze and set up in the forum, for anyone who could read. The Licinian section laws of 367 BCE were a further landmark. They required that one of the two consuls be a plebeian, opening the highest office of the Republic to the non-patrician majority for the first time. The Lex Ogonia of 300 BCE opened the major priestly colleges to plebeians. The Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE made resolutions of the plebeian assembly binding on the whole Roman people, including the patricians, without requiring Senate confirmation. By 287 BCE, the conflict of the orders was, in its essential legal form, over. The patrician monopoly on political and religious power had been dismantled, office by office, law by law, over more than 2 centuries of patient pressure. A new Roman ruling class had emerged, the nobiles, the noble families, composed of both patrician clans and plebeian families that had achieved consulships and built up the kind of distinguished political record that conferred social prestige. The old distinction between patrician and plebeian remained important socially and religiously. Certain priesthood stayed in patrician hands, certain ceremonies retained their patrician character. But as a matter of political exclusion, it was finished. This process is remarkable for what it reveals about the Roman character. The plebeians did not overthrow the Roman system. They did not make a revolution. They used the tools the system itself provided, the assembly, the legal process, the threat of collective withdrawal, to change the system from within. And the patricians, for all their resistance, ultimately accepted the changes, because the alternative, a genuine class war that would have destroyed the unified Roman state just as it was becoming powerful enough to dominate its world, was worse than accommodation. The Roman Republic was, in this sense, a political system of remarkable resilience. It could absorb pressure. It could change. It was not infinitely elastic, as its eventual collapse in the 1st century BCE would demonstrate. But for its first several centuries, it proved capable of managing deep social tensions in ways that kept the community functional enough to expand, to win wars, to build the foundations of empire. Let us step back from the political story for a moment and think about what daily life looked like in the early Republic in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Because history is not only the story of constitutions and laws and military campaigns. It is also the story of mornings and meals and the particular quality of light on a winter afternoon. And those things are worth inhabiting for a while, especially on a night like this one. The Roman house in the early Republic was still relatively simple. The typical domus, the family home, was organized around a central open space called the atrium, which was both a reception room and a gathering place for the household. A rectangular opening in the roof, called the compluvium, let in light and air and rain, and beneath it, in the floor, a shallow pool called the impluvium collected the rainwater that ran off the roof. The hearth was nearby, and around it the family conducted much of its daily life. The beds were in rooms off the atrium, simple wooden frames strung with cord and covered with linen or wool. The kitchen was at the back, smoky and warm, where the household slave, Early Roman households, even relatively modest ones, owned slaves, prepared the daily meals. The Romans ate simply by later standards. Their staple was pulse, a thick porridge of emmer wheat or spelt, cooked with water or milk, seasoned with salt or olive oil or whatever the household could afford. They ate dried legumes, lentils and beans and chickpeas, cooked into thick soups. They ate cured olives from the tree in the courtyard. They ate dried figs and, in season, fresh fruit and vegetables from the garden plot. Meat was a luxury for most Roman families, associated with sacrifice, the occasion when animals were killed for the gods and the worshippers ate the portions not consumed by the divine fire. Fish was more accessible, especially the small dried and salted fish that were the working person's protein supplement, eaten with bread dipped in oil. The Romans drank wine, but wine diluted with water, usually in a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the kind of thing that foreigners did, people without the self-discipline and the cultural sophistication that the Roman tradition demanded. A man who got drunk in the Roman Republic was a man who had lost control of himself, and self-control was perhaps the central Roman virtue. The father of the household, the paterfamilias, held legal authority over every member of his household that was in some ways difficult to fully comprehend from a modern perspective. His authority, the patria potestas, was in legal theory absolute. He could sell family members into slavery, disown children, execute household members who had committed serious offenses against the household's honor. In practice, these extreme powers were very rarely exercised, constrained as they were by custom and social expectation and the opinion of the extended family and the wider community. But the legal framework was there, and it expressed something real about how the Romans understood the household as a unit. The father was its center, its judge, its link to the ancestors and to the gods of the household. The Roman mother occupied a position that was legally subordinate but socially significant. She was the mater familias, the mother of the family, and the management of the household was, in practical terms, largely in her hands. She supervised the household slaves. She organized the food supply and the domestic economy. She was present at family religious ceremonies. She educated her children, especially in the early years. And the Roman tradition, from its earliest period, celebrated the virtuous mother with an intensity that suggests this role was understood as genuinely important, not merely decorative. The ideal Roman matron was, in the traditional image, always at her loom. You will recall that Lucretia was found weaving by lamplight when the story of the founding of the Republic begins. Spinning and weaving wool into cloth for her household was the activity that most concisely expressed the Roman idea of female virtue. Productive, domestic, beautiful in its usefulness, connected to the deepest traditions of the household and the community. This was, of course, an idealized image. Wealthy Roman women had slaves to do the actual weaving. But the image persisted because it said something the Romans wanted to say about themselves. That even at the highest social levels, the Roman woman's dignity was rooted in the care of her household, in the visible management of the resources that sustained her family and, by extension, the community. The Roman child grew up in a world that was simultaneously harsh and warm. Childhood was short, in the sense that children were expected to begin contributing to the household economy from a young age and were treated as adults, legally and socially, at an age that modern societies would consider premature. But childhood was also, in the Roman household, a period of considerable affection and care. Roman literature and art from all periods shows parents playing with children, holding them, mourning them with extravagant grief when they died young, which they did with terrible frequency in a world without germ theory or antibiotics or clean water supplies. The Roman child learned, above all, by watching. The father took his son to the forum to watch legal proceedings and political debates. The mother took her daughter to religious ceremonies and community gatherings. The child absorbed, through observation and imitation, the values and behaviors and ways of thinking that the community had determined were proper. Education in the formal sense, reading and writing and arithmetic, came later, and for a long time in the early Republic, it was conducted in the home or in small private schools, not in any public institution. What the child learned first and most deeply was the mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. This phrase, which translates roughly as the way the ancestors did things, was perhaps the single most important concept in the Roman moral vocabulary. The ancestors had established, through their choices and their practices, the proper way to do everything: how to conduct a sacrifice, how to greet a social superior, how to behave in the Senate, how to treat a client, how to mourn the dead. These customs were not merely convenient habits. They were, in the Roman understanding, the accumulated wisdom of the entire community across all the generations that had preceded this one, tested by time and confirmed by the evidence of Rome's continued survival and growth. To depart from the mos maiorum was not just eccentric. It was dangerous. It was a form of arrogance, an assumption that you, a single person in a single generation, knew better than all the accumulated experience of the community. And since the relationship between proper behavior and divine favor was so central to the Roman worldview, departing from the mos maiorum was also, potentially, a form of religious risk. A way of disrupting the pax deorum, the peace with the gods that kept Rome safe. This conservatism was not absolute. Rome changed. It changed enormously over the course of its history. But it always needed to present its changes as continuations, as recoveries of ancient practice, as returning to something that had been temporarily lost rather than as innovations. The tribune was not a new institution. It was an ancient right of the Roman people being exercised for the first time. The new law was not a departure from the mos maiorum. It was a clarification of what the ancestors had always intended. This was the rhetorical shape of Roman change, and it served its purpose remarkably well. The army was, throughout the early republic, the institution that most completely expressed and shaped the Roman character. Military service was not a profession in the modern sense. There was no standing army in the early republic, no career soldiers. The army was the citizen body under arms, called up when there was a war to fight and released when the fighting was done. Every able-bodied Roman male citizen between the ages of roughly 17 and 45 was, in principle, available for military service, and was expected to turn out when called, equipped at his own expense according to his wealth. The Roman army of the early and middle republic fought in a formation called the Manipular Legion, developed sometime in the 4th century BCE as an improvement on the older hoplite-style phalanx that the Romans had probably borrowed, like so much else, from their Etruscan and Greek neighbors. The manipular system was more flexible than the phalanx, better suited to the varied terrain of the Italian hills and to fighting multiple opponents in different tactical situations. It organized the infantry into units of roughly 120 men, the maniples, which could operate semi-independently on the battlefield, responding to local conditions while still working within the framework of a coordinated battle plan. The Roman soldier, the legionary in the Latin, carried 2 heavy javelins called pila, designed to be thrown at the moment of clash, their iron shanks bending on impact so they could not be thrown back. Behind the javelins came the gladius, the short stabbing sword, and the large shield called the scutum, slightly curved and tall enough to protect from chin to knee. The tactical logic of the Roman system was simple. Disrupt the enemy line with massed javelin volleys, then close to hand-to-hand distance where the short gladius was more effective in the press than the longer swords most enemies carried. What made the Roman army genuinely formidable was not primarily its equipment or its formation, though both were excellent. It was the training, the discipline, and the esprit de corps that the legionary system built over years of shared service. Roman soldiers were not heroic individual warriors in the Homeric style, seeking personal glory in single combat. They were members of a unit, responsible for the man on their left and the man on their right, trained to hold their position in the line even when everything in the animal body wanted to run. The Roman military virtue was not audacity but steadiness, the ability to do the thing you were trained to do, in the order you were told to do it while people were trying to kill you. This virtue, steadiness, reliability, the subordination of individual impulse to collective purpose, was, the Romans believed, the same virtue that had built their city and their institutions. The man who held his place in the battle line was the same man who held his place in the assembly, who fulfilled his obligations to his clients, who maintained the rights of his household, who observed the mos maiorum in every detail of his daily life. Pietas, duty not merely to the gods but to every relationship and every obligation of which a Roman life was composed, was the thread that ran through all of it. The wars of the early and middle Republic were many and, for a long time, mainly local. The first century of the Republic was dominated by intermittent conflicts with the neighboring Latin communities, the Etruscans to the north, and the Equi and Volsci, hill peoples from the Apennines who raided the Latin plain with considerable persistence. These were not grand campaigns of conquest. They were grinding, seasonal wars fought over very small distances, over grazing rights and boundary markers and the status of particular communities within the Latin alliance that Rome increasingly dominated. The war with Veii was different. Veii was an Etruscan city, barely 12 miles north of Rome across the Tiber, and for roughly a century, historians argue about the exact dating. Rome and Veii were in intermittent conflict over the fertile farmland between them. The final siege of Veii, which ancient sources date to 396 BCE and which Livy describes in dramatic detail, lasted 10 years. A Roman equivalent, the Romans themselves pointed out, of the 10-year siege of Troy. The Roman commander Camillus took the city by digging tunnels beneath its walls, and Veii fell. Its population was enslaved or scattered. Its territory was divided among Roman citizens. And Rome, which had up until this point been a significant power in a small region, suddenly doubled in the land it controlled. For years after the fall of Veii came the disaster. The Gauls, Celtic peoples from north of the Alps, moving south in search of new territory, or hired by Italian cities nervous about Roman expansion, or both, crossed into northern Italy and moved south. They defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River, a defeat so complete and so humiliating that the date of the battle, July 18th, was ever afterward marked in the Roman calendar as a dies irae, a black day, a day on which no favorable action could be taken. The Gauls entered Rome. Most of the city was abandoned. The population had fled, leaving behind only the old men who refused to go and the garrison on the Capitoline Hill, which held out in a siege while the rest of Rome burned below them. The Gauls occupied the city for months, looting and burning, before eventually being persuaded to leave. The ancient sources say they were paid a ransom, and that when the Romans complained about the Gallic weights being dishonest, the Gallic leader Brennus threw his sword onto the scale with the comment, "Vi victis, woe to the conquered." The Gallic sack of 390 BCE left physical scars on the city that archaeologists can still identify in the archaeological record. There is a burn layer in the soil of the Forum and surrounding areas that dates to this period. The city that was rebuilt on top of it was, in many ways, a different city from the one that had burned, more hastily constructed, less carefully laid out, the organic disorder of a community rebuilding quickly rather than planning deliberately. It also left psychological scars that never fully healed. The Gauls remained, in the Roman imagination, a people of primal terror, the original barbarians, the chaos beyond the boundary, the dark force that had come out of the north and proved that Rome was not invincible. Centuries later, when Gallic tribes appeared at the frontiers of the Republic, the terror of 390 BCE still lived in Roman memory. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the Senate's emergency decree, could still be justified by invoking the Gallic peril, still drawing power from a catastrophe that had happened before any living Roman's grandfather was born. But Rome rebuilt. Of course it rebuilt. That was what Rome did. It burned and it rebuilt. It lost and it recovered. It was beaten down and it came back, each time a little harder, a little more organized, a little more determined. Camillus, the victor of Veii, became the hero of the recovery, the second founder of Rome in the later tradition, the man who rallied the demoralized survivors and rebuilt the city and restored the institutions and refused to let what had happened be the end. There was a debate, according to Livy, and whether it is historical or a later invention, it is a wonderful story, about whether Rome should be abandoned after the Gallic sack in a new city founded at Veii, whose buildings were still standing and whose territory was already Roman. The arguments for this were practical. Veii was intact. Rome was rubble and ash. Why rebuild when a ready-made city was available? Camillus, in Livy's telling, addressed the Roman people. He spoke of the sacred sites, the religious history, the specific divine presences that inhabited the hills and valleys of Rome and could not simply be relocated. He spoke of the Capitoline, which had held when everything else fell. He spoke of the Tiber and the hills, and the specific topography of the place that had been chosen. in some deeper sense than merely human calculation, for the city to be built. He spoke of the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, that could only be maintained here in this place, where the gods had always been worshipped. Whether Camillus actually gave this speech or not, the Romans decided to stay. They rebuilt on the same hills, over the same foundations, in the same bend of the same river. They kept their city where it had always been, because the city was not merely a collection of buildings but a set of relationships, with the land, with the gods, with the ancestors who were buried in its soil and who could not be left behind. Rome stayed, and Rome grew. Over the following century, through the complicated middle years of the 4th century BCE, Rome extended its control across the Italian peninsula with a methodical patience that was entirely characteristic of the Roman approach to large problems. Not in a single dramatic campaign, not through the personal genius of a single great commander, but through the steady application of Roman military discipline, Roman legal sophistication, and Roman skill in converting defeated enemies into useful allies. The Latin War of 340 to 338 BC ended with the dissolution of the Old Latin League and its replacement with a series of individual relationships between Rome and each of the former league members. Some communities received full Roman citizenship. Others received a partial citizenship, the Latin rights, that gave them many of the legal benefits of Roman citizenship without the full political participation. Others remained formally independent but bound by treaty to provide troops for Roman wars and to follow Roman foreign policy. This system, extending Roman control through differentiated relationships rather than simply through conquest and annexation, was one of Rome's most important political innovations. The Italic peoples who came under Roman dominance were not simply subjects. They had stakes in the Roman system, rights within it, obligations that came with benefits. They were not always happy. There were revolts and resentments and the persistent tension between the desire for full citizenship and the reality of lesser status. But the system worked in the sense that it held together well enough, most of the time, for Rome to present a unified face to the outside world and to marshal the military resources of an increasingly large portion of the Italian peninsula. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, Rome was no longer a regional power. It was a Mediterranean power. The great wars against Carthage, the Punic Wars, which ran in 3 phases from 264 to 146 BCE, would transform the Republic into something its founders could not have imagined. They would give Rome Sicily and Sardinia and Spain and eventually the smoking ruins of Carthage itself, as well as the habits of empire that would follow it into every subsequent century of its existence. But that is a story for another night. Tonight we are staying beside the river. Tonight we are keeping to the beginning, to the small and a quiet and human-scaled world of the first centuries, to the place before the marble and the empire and the grandeur. Because it is in that place, in those first uncertain centuries beside the Tiber, that Rome found the character it would carry with it through everything that followed. The character, in the end, was this: a love of law, not merely as an instrument of power, but as a thing valuable in itself. The idea that the community is held together by rules that apply to everyone, that even the most powerful person in the state is not above the law that the state has made. This idea was never perfectly realized. It was violated constantly by the powerful and the ambitious and the corrupt throughout Roman history. But it was there as an ideal, as a standard against which violations could be measured and condemned. And that standard endured. A love of tradition. Not a blind attachment to the past, but a recognition that the accumulated wisdom of many generations deserves respect, that what has been proven by time has a kind of authority that the merely novel cannot claim. This conservatism sometimes made Rome slow and sometimes made Rome wrong. But it also gave Rome a stability and a continuity that allowed it to weather disasters that would have destroyed a more volatile political system. A love of duty. The Romans had a word, pietas, that is usually translated as piety but means something much broader. The proper discharge of all obligations to the gods, to the family, to the state, to every relationship that a life contains. Ennius was called pious Ennius, dutiful Ennius, not because he was particularly religious, but because he kept faith with all his obligations even when it cost him everything. That quality, the willingness to do what needs to be done even when it is hard, was what the Romans held up as their deepest virtue. and a love of the particular. The Romans were not, at heart, abstract thinkers. They were a people of specific places and specific times and specific relationships. Their gods lived in specific groves and specific springs and specific corners of specific houses. Their law was built from specific cases and specific precedents. Their military discipline was built from specific units and specific commanders and specific traditions of specific legions. The universal emerged from the particular, and the particular was always respected, always honored. These qualities, these loves, were present in Rome from the beginning. From the circles in the Palatine soil and the dark waters of the Tiber and the small fires burning on the hilltops in the last years before the city had a name. They were carried through the centuries, through the Republic in the Empire in the long twilight of the West, and they passed, in forms that are sometimes easy to recognize and sometimes very difficult, into the world we inhabit tonight. When you read a legal brief, you are working in a tradition that descends, in part, from the 12 bronze tablets set up in the Forum of early Rome. When you walk across a bridge that has stood for 2,000 years, you are walking on Roman engineering, Roman mathematics, Roman stubbornness. When a government official swears an oath to uphold the law rather than to serve the person who appointed them, they are speaking across the centuries in the language that Rome first taught the world. These inheritances are real and they are worth knowing about. But they are not what matters most about Rome's early history, not on a night like this one. What matters most is simpler. What matters is the river. What matters is that once, a very long time ago, in a place that is still there and a river that is still running and under stars that are still bright in the Italian sky, a group of people chose to stay. They chose to build in this particular place, beside this particular bend of water, on these particular hills. They chose to make it home. And they defended that choice through fire and war and plague and political crisis and the grinding weight of centuries because they believed, because they knew, that what they were building was worth the cost of building it. The Tiber is still running. We have traveled a long way tonight, through the myths of mythology and the more solid ground of early history, through the age of kings and the birth of the Republic, through the slow, patient work of lawmaking and army building and the complicated negotiations of a community growing into itself. We have spent time with Romulus and Numa, with the Vestals tending their fire and the augurs reading their birds, with the plebeians withdrawing to their sacred hill and returning in triumph, with Camillus refusing to leave the ashes of a city that had earned the right to be rebuilt. We have spent time, most importantly, with the river. The Tiber at night is a patient companion. It does not require anything of you. It simply moves as it has always moved, through the city and past the city and beyond the city, toward the sea that it has been seeking since the first snowmelt from the Apennines found its way into the headwaters and began the long journey down. It carries the rain of 100 seasons and the reflections of 100,000 nights of stars, and it carries them all with the same unhurried gravity, the same deep, unconcerned flow. Sit with it for a moment. Let the story settle into you the way the Tiber's water settles into the flat land of its floodplain, spreading quietly through every available space, finding its level, leaving behind, when it finally recedes, the dark, rich gift of its silt. The world is very still at this hour. The Forum is quiet. The temples are dark except for the small eternal flame in Vesta's round sanctuary, burning just as it has burned every night through all the years of Rome's long story, tended by careful hands, fed with clean wood, kept alive through every catastrophe and every triumph and every ordinary Tuesday evening when nothing was happening and the city simply breathed and went about its business. That flame. Think for a moment about what it means, a fire that has been kept burning deliberately and reverently for centuries. Not because anyone has proven it makes any practical difference, not because the theology is clear and the metaphysics are settled, but because the fire is the continuity, the fire is the threat. As long as the fire burns, the Rome that lights it is still the same Rome that first kindled it, still connected to the founders and the kings and the Vestals of all the previous generations, still part of the same long story that began beside the river on an ordinary autumn evening when the light was gold and the air smelled of herbs and the hills looked like sleeping animals in the last warmth of the day. You are part of a long story too. Every life is. Every person who lies down in the dark and closes their eyes and lets the day go is part of a chain that reaches back through all the years and all the generations to the first human being who lay down in the dark and felt the weight of the earth beneath them and heard the wind in the trees and thought, "This is where I am. This is what this feels like. To be here, to be alive, to be tired in the good way that comes at the end of a day fully lived, to feel the body wanting sleep. That sensation is as old as everything. The farmer on the Palatine in the 9th century BCE felt it. The Vestal rising before dawn to check the sacred fire felt it. The soldier who had marched all day through the Italian hills and laid down his pack and his shield and felt the ground rise up to meet him with that quiet generosity that only the earth has, he felt it. The consul closing his eyes on the night before a great vote, feeling the weight of the decision that tomorrow would bring, feeling beneath that weight the older and more fundamental pull of the body toward sleep. He felt it. We all feel it. And in that feeling, in this universal drawing down into the dark and the rest and the quiet, we are joined to everyone who has ever lived and breathed and needed sleep. The great and the humble, the remembered and the forgotten, the consul and the farmer and the vestal and the slave and the child and the soldier and the old man who sat down beside the Tiber one evening and never got up again. All of them felt what you feel now. The need for rest, the softening of the day's tension, the body's quiet, insistent wisdom about what comes next. Let it come. The stars above the Palatine Hill are very still tonight. They have been still for thousands of years above this particular hill, these particular stars, burning their patient light across an emptiness so vast that it makes all human history, even the longest and the greatest, look like a small thing. And yet from up there, if you could be up there among them looking down, you would see the light. The cities with their millions of lights. The roads that connect them still tracing, in some of their older courses, the lines that Roman surveyors laid down 2,000 years ago. The courts and the laws and the constitutions and all the invisible architecture of the world we have built, which bears, in so many of its deepest structures, the fingerprints of people who lived beside a river on a set of modest hills and decided, without knowing what they were deciding, to build something that would last. Lasted. The sacred fire has burned down to its gentlest state now, the state it reaches in the deepest hours of the night when the air is still and the wood has had time to become pure heat and pure light and nothing else. It glows. The glow is warm and orange and very soft, softer than candlelight, the color of the inside of a closed eye when the sun falls on your face, the color of warmth remembered. The Tiber moves. It has been moving all through this long evening, all through the stories and the kings and the laws and the wars and the fires and the rebuildings, all through everything. Patient and unhurried and entirely without ambition, the river does the one thing it knows how to do. It flows. It moves from the mountain to the sea, carries what it is given. It deposits what it carries, and then it goes on. There is a lesson in that if you need a lesson. But you don't need a lesson tonight. Tonight you only need the sound of the water and the warmth of the fire and the slow drift of a story that has taken you far and brought you back, that has reached back across the centuries to the beginning of something great and walk you, very gently, through its early days. The early days, when Rome was small and new and uncertain, when the hills were covered in scrub oak and the streets were dirt and the houses were wattle and daub with thatched roofs, and the most important things in the world were the harvest and the rain and the fire that burned through the night in the center of the household. When the forum was still a marsh between the hills, and the cattle grazed where the temples would one day stand, and the river ran wide and brown below the Palatine, and the mornings smelled of herbs and river mud and the particular sweetness of an Italian summer morning before anything has gone wrong. That is the Rome we have been visiting. That small and human Rome, the Rome before the marble, the Rome before the legions that would conquer the world, the Rome that was still just a gathering of people beside a river, learning what they were capable of, finding out slowly and painfully and gloriously what it meant to be themselves. It is very quiet now. The wind has stopped. The river is running silently or nearly so, a soft rushing sound, very distant, very steady, like breathing. Like your own breathing, actually, slow and deep, in and out, in and out. The body doing its ancient work without being asked, without any effort at all, the way the river does its work, the way the stars burn their light, the way the fire glows in the last dark hours of the night. And out. Let the day go now. Let it drift away from you the way a leaf drifts away when you place it on a moving stream. Not pushed, not hurried, simply released and then carried gently and inexorably by the current, smaller and smaller in the distance until it is gone. The things that need to be done tomorrow will still need to be done tomorrow. They're not going anywhere. They will be waiting for you, patient and unconcerned, when the morning comes and the light returns and the world starts up again. But they cannot reach you here in this quiet, in this soft and heavy rest that is coming. They cannot reach you here. You are beside the river. The stars are out. The fire has burned down to its warmth. And somewhere on the dark hillside, in a small round house with a thatched roof and a packed earth floor, the first people of Rome are sleeping too, curved on their sides, the wool blanket pulled up, the embers giving off the last of their warmth, the city they are building, the city they cannot yet imagine, waiting patiently in the ground beneath their feet. We are all sleeping. The Tiber carries the moonlight south. The hills are still. The flame burns on. Rest now. Rest well. The river will still be running in the morning. The hills will still be there. And the long story of the people who built something remarkable beside this ancient water will still be here too, waiting for the next time you want to visit, patient as the river, patient as the stars, patient as the old and faithful dark. Good night, Rome.